on matters not on the agenda.
All the public first. When do all those things happen?
Special meeting, but we added it just in light of the public interest. So if there's anything that's not covered by agenda topics,
So I'm gonna start off. You guys ready?
Yeah, let me make sure. Jason, are you ready to go?
Jason, are you good?
Who's Jason?
I don't know.
From PCT, because we're streaming on channel 27.
Okay. 2020 City of Half Moon Bay Finance Subcommittee Special Meeting. Finance Subcommittee Special Meeting. We're happy to have you join us today. I'm going to start off by just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you've got a phone, would you kindly just mute the ringer just in case during the process, so we don't have anybody kind of making noise in the middle of the process. And also, if you want to mute your actual self on Zoom until it's your turn to talk, that might be good, except for some of the different council members and Bob. Keep yourself unmuted because you'll probably be talking enough, but just for the rest of the people, we have, I'm going to start off with a call to order, which is item A. And do we have to do a roll call?
Mayor Eisen?
Here.
Councilmember Reddick?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay. And we'll roll right into, it sounds like items B and C. Item B is the fiscal year 2019-2020 budget actuals. And item C is the fiscal year 2020-2021 budget and projections, are going to kind of be talked through together. And then we'll open it up for public comment after that. And then Debbie and I will comment after that. Does that suit everybody on the call currently? Okay, let's start off then with item B, which is fiscal year 2019-2020 budget actual.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Reddick, if someone could put up the presentation. And this is Bob Nisbet, City Manager. I'll be running through the presentation today. We also have.
Hey Bob, can you hold for 1 second? Somebody I think's got multiple maybe equipment on and don't have muted.
Let's have everybody mute themselves. Yeah, there we go. So here we go. Go ahead, Bob. Try again.
Okay, that sounds better. So I just want to introduce the staff that's here today. Of course, city attorneys here, but 3 members from the Administrative Services Department who did the lion's share of all this work, put all these numbers together. They've been working really hard for the last 3-4 weeks. The directors here, Lisa Lopez, 2 staff, Brian Lopez and also Kenneth Stiles. They'll be available for questions. Also, of course, Jessica Blair, your clerk, is here helping us through the meeting. This is new technology for us. And then your Public Works Director, John Dowdy, is here. There's going to be a section where we talk about capital, so we thought he should be here for questions on that. And Matthew is also here for general questions, but also when we get to the next item on Stone Pine, he took the lead on that and will be available for questions on that. The presentation we're about to run through is slightly different than the one that was posted online. The presentation was posted online maybe 48 hours ago, and we've made a couple adjustments to it. So folks following along will see those. They'll be really clear. We added a slide or two, and then we also have a couple extra slides that in case we're just ready, if there's certain questions, we want to have all the material available. So again, we're getting used to using Zoom as staff. On one hand, we're adjusting. On the other hand, it's almost easier for us to have material available because we can quickly share it with everyone through Zoom, which is a nice feature. So with that, if you could click to the next slide. So as mentioned, there are 3 items on the agenda. We're going to take the first 2 together, and then as the mayor said, we can pause there and open it up for the committee members and the public as well. And then we'll take the third one separately and do the same thing. Next slide, please. So I want to start with this. This table is more detail than what I presented in an update at the last council meeting. At the last council meeting, I just did an update because it was a work in progress on us trying to predict our revenue shortfalls and our projections for next year. And so I made a statement, and I think I did say about 3 million. Here you see 3.1 million. So just to take everyone through this table, column, it's our 4 main revenue sources: transiency, occupancy tax, property tax, sales tax, and then we've combined a variety of revenue sources together in the last column. And you can see our budget for fiscal year 19-20, column 1, 16.3 million. And then you can see our latest estimate given the circumstances. So now we're predicting a shortfall in TOT. Property tax, we are estimating would be flat to finish the year. Sales tax will drop 825, and then a little bit out of all the other sources as well. So those numbers there make up the 3.1 million that I mentioned at the last meeting and here today. We have to make up this shortfall going into the end of the year. So luckily for us and for, I guess, probably most local governments, the last 5 years, even 10 years, have been a growing economy, and for the most part, by and large, we've probably finished the last few years in the black. So we actually budget, and then we spend a little bit less than our budget because we have savings or projects get delayed or so forth. And then what happens in that instance is that money, we have kind of a modified zero-based budgeting process. If we have a surplus at the end of a fiscal year, that money rolls in and is available to us as we start to budget the next year. So that's been kind of the way it's been for a while. And now here we are, we're predicting a $3.1 million shortfall come June 30th. So we have to plug that number. We have to close the books and have revenues equal expenses and plug that 3.1 million when we close our books. So that's what we're going to talk about here in the next few slides, and then I'll move on to looking ahead to next year.
Bob, can I just ask a real quick clarifying? Can you just, so the public's all aware as well, just talk to us about when the budget cycle ends, our fiscal year?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. So we're on a fiscal year that starts July 1st of each year and ends June 30th. So that's how we plan our budgeting. And we are right now mid-April. So there are only 2.5 months left in the fiscal year. As this started to unfold, go back as long as you want, but certainly back to the stay in place order 4.5 weeks ago, that was when all of a sudden we started to see the precipitous drops in TOT and sales tax, obviously once the businesses closed their doors. So it's been that last period of time that we've been scrambling to try to predict these estimates. Next slide. So to plug, so we have, a couple different challenges, obviously, several challenges. And the one challenge is to plug that 3.1 million so we can close our books and plan for next year's budget. That's the immediate challenge. We have to do that. Then the next challenge, which we'll get to next, is planning ahead for next year and starting to talk about more options that we would have to employ to deal with next year, where the problem is going to be even bigger than 3.1 million. So just what are we doing to plug the 3.1 million? So first, of course, we're cutting lots of different little things, I'll say, things in the staff's operating budgets. So I'll start at the bottom. By doing this, we believe we can save $750,000 by the end of June. So this is a mix of a lot of things. I want to be clear on that. We put some examples up here, cut, various materials and supplies. There's some consultant contracts that we're stopping. We're not filling some positions, the hiring freeze. So there's just some examples there. But there's also, it's not just cuts, but there's also just savings that we're putting in this number. For example, salary savings is an obvious one. Although we're essentially fully staffed now, we were not fully staffed between July 1st and December. We had, 3, 4, 5 vacant positions. So we then filled those positions, and now we're, of course, paying those salaries. But we incurred savings during that first half of the year. So something like that is also in this 750 figure. So it's a mixture of everything we can cut, non-essential supply type items, operational type items. This is not the big capital stuff. And then also just things that were budgeted that are not going to be spent. We've now looked at them and said, oh, that's not going to happen anyway. So we're saving that. And that's the 750 there. So 700, remember that number, and then we'll go to the next slide. So the 2.4 now, we're just doing backwards math here. We started with 3.1, and with the 750,000 savings, that takes that deficit down to 2.4. So at this point, if we did nothing further, that would dip into the city's reserves. And so I kind of want to make that clear, and we'll get into the reserves in a second. The reserves, I would not describe as an option, although they are an option. They're really the default option, because the council has already set up those reserves for this purpose. We're in a crisis. We're in a pandemic. This is something that happens, 5 generations, every 100 years. So the council has set up reserves and already have, in a sense, directed that those reserves would be used during this time. So that's the default option. What we want to do is look at options, other options, to even avoid dipping into the reserves if we can. So I just wanted to make that point that we do have to, again, we have to close the books. And if we were to do nothing, we would automatically have to dip into the reserves if we didn't take other steps. Next slide. So here are some other true options that can be employed to solve the $3.1 million deficit without dipping into the reserve yet. And so this is kind of what's on the table for the subcommittee to consider today. And it's the first 2 bullet points. And essentially, it's looking at our capital budget and budgeted money that had been budgeted for certain capital projects that have not moved forward, are either stalled or we have savings in them this year. We're making the recommendation that that money should be pulled back to fund the deficit. So bullet point 1, we've totaled all the projects up where we think we can do this, and it equals about 1.8 million. And so that would be an action where the city council, if the subcommittee moves it forward, would essentially reallocate that money back to our unassigned or our reserves, so it's available when we close the books to bridge the 3.1 million gap. And then the next item is also
Bob, real quick. Do you want, like, on that one, obviously we'd love to know what those projects are. Should I wait till the end?
Yeah. The next slide, we're going to go through them in detail, and that's where we could, at that point, I think, have the two of you ask questions, because I think there might be some questions for John Dowdy, on specific projects. So those are the next 2 slides. And then the 480,000 is also in the capital fund, essentially, and this is money that the city received late last year as part of a settlement, and the direction from the city council was to apply that money to bike trail projects. Our recommendation today, given the grave circumstances, is to reallocate that back to general purposes so that it does not have to only go to bike trails, and then it would also then be used to bridge the 3.1 million gap. So doing the math, the 3.1 less 750 got us to 2.4, 2.4 minus 1.8 got down to 6, and then the 480, we're down to about 100,000. And we're going to continue to work on that again, the goal is not to dip into the reserves this fiscal year. And so we're going to continue working on that. Maybe our revenue projections aren't quite right, and we don't know. There's lots of moving parts here, but the goal is to make these adjustments and land June 30th without dipping into the reserve, knowing that if we miss it by 50,000, 100,000, then again, it becomes the default option. And that's the third bullet point. And also just noting that we're reading the papers like everyone else, and all the cities are grappling with this, and they're doing a mixture of things that are similar to things we're doing as well. So the next 2 slides are a list of all the projects that make up the 1.8 million. So these 2 slides were not in the PowerPoint that was presented online. So for the members of the audience today, we're all seeing 2 new slides here. So project by project, I did not plan to go into detail. This is page 1, and then the next page is another $1 million worth of projects. But each project has a slightly, different story. Some projects, maybe there might be a couple that were completed and there was money left over. There may be some projects where they're partway done, and so we essentially are recommending to pause or delay them. And then there's some projects, for example, emergency response program. That money was allocated at the beginning of the year, 100,000 emergency response program, and it just is something that we have not gotten to yet, or we didn't pursue. So we don't intend to spend, we weren't going to spend that money by June 30th anyway. And so essentially, it's not that we're delaying something. We're basically saying, well, we're not going to spend that by June 30th, pull it back, and then we can reassess later. So it's every one of these is a combination of those factors in terms of pulling the money back. In terms of delay, for the most part, the delay would be next year, because pulling the money back is not really delaying anything by June 30th. But if we don't refund these next year, then absolutely, then these projects would not occur next year. So unless there's any questions on specific projects, maybe flash the next slide so you can see the full picture. So here are the rest of the projects that total up to 1.8 million. And again, John Dowdy is here to answer any specific questions about any of these projects.
It looks like
Please
Debbie's
unmute.
got a question.
Please unmute. Jessica, I think you have to unmute.
No,
Jeff.
she can unmute herself. Or Jessica, can you
Who
unmute
are
her?
who are you trying to access?
Debbie,
Debbie?
Debbie Reddick wants to talk.
Councilmember Reddick.
I could do all day too.
There you go.
So, my concern about the Highway 1 bicycle pedestrian trail, was that our committed match to getting the grant that we were recently awarded? Would we be foregoing a grant as a result of this, or?
Mr. Dowdy, can you speak to that?
So, John, here, thanks. Sorry, I guess I'll even go on video. Our feeling was this, is that what we were asked to do was look at what could we live without in this current fiscal year, what were we not going to spend, and what were we going to kind of work from at that point. So from the perspective of the grant funding and any of these things using for match, none of these are critical at this moment in time for the match point for those grants. The question really comes with the adoption of the CIP for 2021 though. And we have been looking at, and clearly, and we can actually go to that, or we can kind of move forward from that. And I'm talking just in generalities with that. That Highway 1 is a different project than the grant funded one.
Okay.
Anyway, so if that makes you feel better, but it sort of is a piece of the whole puzzle, which is that in many instances, we have kind of gone through that process, and we can roll that into that slide or not at some point and show you what we kind of went through in terms of looking at the ranking process. But clearly, where we were heavily leveraged with grant funds was something that we as staff felt was important to put to the forefront and identify as a high priority to continue. You will notice on this that you don't see any of the Highway 1 north or south projects on this list. Those are primarily being funded with grant funds or with other private funds, the development impact fees, for example, for Pacific Ridge. The other thing that you're not getting the full feel for this list of projects is that there are a lot of other projects that are non-general fund funded. So when we talk about the capital improvement program, we are not foregoing every bit of capital project work that we're dealing with. It's just those that involved capital funding, and where we were focused in terms of looking at what would be spent by year end. And these were the ones we felt comfortable that would not be spent. We would not be spending money on these by year end, or we can certainly hold back and not spend money. I think Bob laid it out pretty clearly from the very beginning, starting with this coming fiscal year is where the really tough decisions are going to be. What do you reprogram back in, and how do you balance that against all the other needs and issues that we have in this situation? So that'll be the bigger and more challenging question moving forward, frankly.
I have a follow-up question. So I'm looking at sidewalk replacement and repair program.
Mm-hmm.
So say we defer this year. I'm just wondering, like, if emergency situations present themselves in terms of, we see that there's a dangerous situation here, somebody's at risk of getting hurt. Do we have like a capital emergency reserve fund that we could tap to make, like spot repairs to really take care of things that are clearly?
We left some money on this one. We left some money and didn't pull it all. So John, what do we here? Like 30,000?
There on several of these items that you're seeing, there was another column, which is the money that was left in there to deal with that very thing. And Bob and Lisa in particular understood the need to protect a small bit of money there for the sidewalks, for us to be able to go in and do the cutting of those to make sure we get rid of the trip and fall hazards, that we make them ADA compliant, and that we have those on a regular cycle. And obviously, if we had one pop up because of a route that just went crazy and it popped up and we had to replace that immediately, we would have the funding to be able to deal with that. It's a small amount, but it's enough that we think to get us through the year end.
And then, so my next question would be about the stair repair at Kenyatta Verde Creek. So is that another situation where we're, leaving us open to a dangerous situation?
Here's the good news. That was the money we're able to put into this is money left over that we didn't need to spend to finalize the project and to get it out there. That was just absolutely, staff being considerate of the cost and bringing that in well under budget from where we had anticipated we might be. Part of that was that at one point, the Coastal Commission staff was asking us to consider moving boulders back around and removing boulders from the area. They finally kind of saw the bigger picture and allowed us just to go in and do the work that we needed to do and leave those extraneous kind of things alone. That left us with this remainder, and we're done with that project. So that does not put us at any risk.
And then the Seymour ditch, are we confident that the interim repairs that we've made there will see us through, a period?
Well, the good news, I guess, bad news, good news, however you want to look at it, it appears that we're primarily through the wet season. Everything is held up really well. I think there are always some things that we can go in, but I think anything and everything that we're looking at out there that are just minor sort of reworking some of the stones out there and some of the dams, the check dams, we can do either in-house or very minimal cost to that point. So we're comfortable. What this again doesn't leave us is with some of the funding that we were potentially going to look to leverage if the Army Corps comes out and basically makes available some of that funding to deal with the watershed biological enhancement project. The bottom line is that we're not convinced that was really money we could use anyway. And again, we'll look at reprogramming as those things come around and making some tough recommendations to the council as they are necessary. But we're comfortable that this is not putting us in any harm's way.
Okay, so just a couple of things. I do know that the Seymour ditch is on the radar of the new San Mateo County Flooding and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District for potential funding. Although their spending also will be probably open to reductions. But then we're also looking at the state is considering a state infrastructure economic stimulus bond for November. And plus we have potentially 2 additional federal stimulus packages. So I'm just guessing that potentially we might qualify. If not for these projects, there may be others on our capital improvements program that are of a nature to, create jobs and offset local deficits. So I think we need to keep that bigger context in mind as well.
Yeah. And if I could, just on the Seymour, one thing, the city engineer and I have a call with a consultant working for the Cal Recycle folks to talk about the landfill and potentially the broader perspective of landfill, Seymour ditch, and kind of that whole bigger picture of how do we address that issue. I really wanted to have that conversation first before we reached out to the new executive director at the agency and to sort of start moving that project forward. So we're planning to move that forward and start to have that conversation with Lynn and their staff and consultant staff. But we were wanting to get some additional information to look at whether we thought there would be funding to leverage against other funds. So we'll be having that next week, I believe, is scheduled.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have right now.
So obviously, this is the first time I've seen these two slides at all. There's a lot to digest. I'd actually like to go through each one by one. We don't have the time for that now, I understand, but there's a lot of information to take in right at the meeting time. So I'm having a hard time digesting this that quickly, but can we include the extra column that you guys are talking about what you held off to the side for each project, at least moving forward in our new staff report as we come into this, so we can see, as Debbie's been asking about very, very smartly, what's left over in that fund. Like you're saying, we've got, $20,000 here, you got $50,000 here, just so we have a sense as council as we move forward with this. A, and then B, can we also have a slide about what is, I guess, being kept? Just so we can, this is a lot of stuff. And then what happens with this is this total savings, this 1.8, in my understanding is like this money disappears now to go into maintaining our budget this year. What is our plan to get money back into every one of these moving forward, especially when we have a $6 million shortfall? Or are we truly just saying that we are going to not do any of these projects ever? And that might be a more apt, like, I don't see this as a delay. I kind of see you guys telling us, or at least my interpretation, and I'm looking for yours, is that, well, if we take all the funding, we're literally defunding every one of these projects. We're not delaying them. We're taking all the money from them and moving it. I'm not even sure where into our current budget to support, I guess, the loss of revenue coming in. But then how do we, all these projects were at one point things that we cared heavily about. How do we refinance them?
Yep, Mr. Mayor, I'll take all three questions. Question number one, absolutely, we'll add that column and we'll make sure we spend some time with you and all the other council members one-on-one to go through these. So this will come back to the council on May 5th. Your committee today is just simply advisory to the full council. So this will come back to the full council on May 5th. So we'll have time to do that. And we'll represent it on the May 5th meeting, and you'll see that extra column of what's left behind. And then also to your second question, a column about what's still being done. John made that point that there's still a lot of projects, and we can share that. And John can really do a full CIP update either at May 5th or May 21st, or whatever date that is. You asked the question, I think at the last council meeting, great question. What is the percentage of general fund in our current CIP to non-general fund? For this fiscal year, the general fund is 24%. It's around $3 million. That's what was allocated at the beginning of the year. And there's approximately $12 million that was allocated for all capital. So there's a lot of non-general fund capital sources, the big ones being the two highway projects. But that can be part of a CIP update as we move towards June, so you can see that full picture. And then your last question is the big question, obviously. Yes, we're doing exactly what you said. We are at this point in a dire situation, and we are looking at everything in terms of cuts. And so that means operational cuts. That means people and salaries potentially, and that also means capital. We have to look everywhere. It just so happens capital is bigger dollar amounts. And so it absolutely is doing that. But we do see it as a delay. We're here for the long term. We've been a city for 60 years, and our CIP is a 5-year rolling document. We do envision a day when we come out the other side of this and we start to grow again. All these projects are going to stay in the CIP, and as things change, we would then refund them. Now, as time changes, new projects might come up, and maybe the choices can be made, but we're not going to lose track of them. And you're right, you are delaying them next year. And if this continues into a recession, it might be a while, but maybe 2 years out, things start to change. And then we're going to be back with you with our next budget, not this one, but a year from now, replenishing, making recommendations to replenish in a systematic way.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure that's a tough pill to swallow for me. But I hear what you're saying. As long as, I mean, it doesn't seem like the shortfall of our town should all be taken by the defunding of all the projects that we deemed necessary for our town to make. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I do realize we're in difficult times, so I'll just kind of save the rest of my comments for later.
Well, we'll get to the recommendations, and that's certainly a fair policy conversation about what's the best way to do this, and are there other options? So we'll have that in 3 slides, I think.
Okay.
Next slide.
Yeah. I just want to add something really quick. So I think a lot of the projects that are on our list are projects that we put on there as our finances stabilized, and they were kind of like things we'd like to do and we're in a good position. So I think what we need to do is have a little triage and distinguish between, essential public works that are consistent with our mission for protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, and those things that are more quality of life issues, which are totally important. I totally believe that, our goal should be, to provide those and address those to the extent we can. But I think we need to do a little triage there.
No, I'm with it. And I mean, during our last council meeting, I made it clear from my perspective, and obviously I'm one person, but I did not want to take directly from all our CIP projects or our capital in order to fund, I felt like there had to be a variation of different ways to make this happen. I made that comment very clear in the last council meeting. So I'm surprised that, that this is the option that we're seeing before us as the only option. I thought we'd have multiple options to look at.
We will see if we can come up with some as we get to the end of the presentation here, and I'll touch on that. So before we get to those recommendations, we will circle back to that exact point you just made, Mr. Mayor. But I am going to shift now to the next challenge, which is looking ahead to next year. So now we're looking at projections for fiscal year 2020, 2021. And again, for the audience, that starts on July 1st of this year for a year. So we're predicting, some big hits for next year. So currently, we're estimating that one of our biggest revenue sources, TOT, would be a 66% decrease, which is 4 million. You see that in red. And this assumes various assumptions that Ken made about occupancy of hotels, how fast they come back, talking to lots of experts. I mean, taking everything into account that we could, it's our best projection at this time. That's our qualifier on it. Best projection at this time. Next slide, please. Same with sales tax, not as big as TOT. Again, best projection at this time based on what we know, information that we have, talking to sales tax consultants and experts in this area, and actually doing some groundwork and reaching out to some of our biggest sales tax producers to try to get inside micro information on what we might expect next year. And so we came up here with a 24% decrease for next year, 690,000. Next slide. So what we're showing here is we just wanted to show the magnitude of the challenge for next year because it is large. And we compared the situation to what happened in the last recession. So in the last recession, fiscal year 2009-10, we dipped 13% in our major revenue sources. Don't necessarily pay attention to the actual numbers. That's not a fair apples to apples because we had lower volume, let's say back then. We've grown since then. So the fair comparison is the percentage. And what we're providing you today is more than double what occurred in 2009, 2010. 29% decrease over what we would have expected. We would have expected 17.5 million, and we're projecting 11 million there. Next slide. So total, here's the number for next year. You total up our loss in TOT, our loss in sales tax. We also predict loss in some of the other various sources. I won't go into the detail, but it totals up to 6 million. Substantial number that we have to grapple with for next year. So back to dividing this challenge into phases. We have to finish the year. We only have 2.5 months to go. And then we have to deliver a recommended budget to the council, which is a balanced budget. The budget by law has to be balanced when we close the books on this year. And when we deliver a budget to you for next year, we have to give you a budget which has options in it and recommendations to close that $6 million gap. This is obviously more challenging than the $3.1 million gap, because if we do use the recommendations to close the 3.1 that we're recommending today, the capital as a big component of that, we're not going to have that option at our disposal for next year. And so this starts to get more challenging in terms of starting to put all options on the table. If we try to use certain options today, we're not going to have those options available to us to solve this problem. So we will be bringing forth a budget in June like we always do. I just wanted to note here, and I think I mentioned it at the last council meeting, cities, we're still talking to other cities. All cities are kind of handling this in different ways. Certainly, every city is grappling with the challenge, just like we are. But in terms of their deliverables, cities are just doing different things. Some are on 2-year budgets. Some are doing continuing resolutions so that they don't produce another big budget, but behind the numbers behind are continued, kind of like the federal government does, and they keep providing. They still have to balance and so forth. But everyone's doing the process part of it differently. I see a budget finance related item on all of our meetings in May and June. So all 4 of those meetings, we will have either a workshop, we'll have a capital session, we'll have, but it'll definitely be there for the council to make these decisions, provide input, and for the public to make their comments as well. Plenty of opportunity. For next year, as we start to prepare the budget, one step we've taken on the operational side is asking all the departments to cut 20% of their operating budgets. So this is the portion of their budget that is not salaries. This is all the other components that I talked about earlier when we were able to make cuts this year to make up that $750,000. That is approximately $1 million. So that's one thing that we're doing. We obviously have to do a lot of other things, but that's just one step that we're taking right now as we start to prepare that budget.
Well, what are we going without with that? I mean, that's a lot of money, $1 million. What is it that we are actually, what changes with the operating budget? Like, are we talking just like staplers, computer pieces? I mean, like $1 million is a ton of money.
It's a lot. And we'll have a more detailed list on May 5th. If anyone of my staff want to jump in on this, it is a mix of a lot of things. It's the small things like you say. It's training and travel. It's consultant contracts. It's putting other certain things on hold. It's a mix of a lot of things across all departments except sheriff.
I was just going to add what Bob is saying, correct. There's some prime areas where over the years, because of the success the city has had, departments have gotten a little bit more flexibility with their training schedules, with their consultant schedules. And so those are the first things we're looking at. Ken is also working with the department heads to determine what's essential in their budget. Our timeline to get these numbers back, this is all a work in progress. So we are scheduled next week to actually get the numbers back from the departments and meet with them again prior to this to kind of go through what they're giving us in terms of cuts.
And let me underscore, this is not unessential items. By making these cuts, we are cutting services. These cuts translate to lower service delivery.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm going with that question, because you know, there may be other ways to go about getting those cuts. Excuse me, because I don't want to have a full, like, you know, I guess I don't know how to put it any differently, but like a full staff with no ability to do any work because we're cutting so much from the people in terms of what they can and cannot do from their budgets. But
Correct.
We'll get deeper into that.
Yes, we will. The next slide, I think, shows that, and I'll hit that point exactly. Next slide, please. Yes, this one does. So let me go through this slide. This is just kind of a tiering approach that led to our recommendations. And certainly this could be debated, and the mayor has already made a very valid point about the trade-off between capital and operations and programs. That the mayor has made that point very eloquently, that there's choices to be made here. And asking the question rhetorically, should we keep capital and cut something else? Those are all, yeah, very important policy decisions. It's all choices, but this tiering level is what backed up our recommendation, the option we put forward. And so operational cutbacks are those small things, the things we just talked about. They do lead to service cuts, but they're the direct connection between those service cuts is a little harder to tease out. But that's what you saw in us making cuts to get the 750 for this year, and certainly the 20% that you just saw on the last slide. Deferring the capital projects, we've talked about that. That can be debated, but that's certainly what we're recommending in terms of solving the challenge this year. Partial use of reserves, we've talked about that. We'll have a reserve slide next. As I said, reserves are there for a purpose. They were consciously decided upon by previous councils to be used for these purposes. The question now, the policy question now is, what's the timing of their use and how much should we use? So the decision to use them has really been made. We're in, I can't think of a worse crisis. The policy decision, again, is the timing and how much. Really important decisions. The next slide is where you really start to get into further true service reductions. The connection is very easily made that something is not going to happen. And the reason is because this fourth one down is staff. This is talking about workforce reductions. Workforce reductions means programs get cut and service levels get cut. There's no doubt about it. It's more of a direct connection than staplers, for example. I say that facetiously, but this is down the tier for us, but this is talking about layoffs and workforce reduction. And then the last one is put there to show the worst case scenario if a city were to get into a challenging situation where they can't balance their budget. Next slide, please. So a comment on reserves. We have several different reserves, and this is, I think, is important. So the main general fund reserves that I keep referring to are the operational reserve and the reserve that the council created last year, the new reserve for economic uncertainty. Those two reserves together total $7.3 million right now. $7.3 million in those two reserves. Those reserves are intended for the situation we're in. There are differences between the two, and it's our intention to refine and bring that policy back. That's the last bullet point on May 5th, given the situation we're in. Back to my point about the timing of their use and how much you use. Really important questions. And so that comes back on May 5th. Those are the general fund reserves. We also have several internal service fund reserves. So these are non-general fund reserves. These reserves, we have a pension reserve. We have a workers' comp and general liability insurance reserve. We have a vehicle replacement reserve. These reserves are because those are separate funds from the general fund, and they're managed as separate funds, which means they're allowed to have a fund balance. In the city's budget, each one of those funds is shown, and each one has a balance in it. Part of what we're thinking about for next year is that we have an opportunity to actually kind of go into the internal service reserves before we go into the general fund reserves. Again, that's a policy discussion that can be had. But essentially, each year, general fund is transferred into the internal service reserves. Each year, they're replenished based on certain factors. We believe the internal service reserves are solvent enough, they're strong enough, that they could essentially take what I call a rate holiday. Again, this is a policy decision, it's a recommendation. This is next year kind of stuff, and stuff that can be discussed in May and June. But it's another, you're looking for more options. It's another option to help bridge the $6 million gap. It's still the same, it's still dipping into reserves. So it's really a corollary, but it's a different color of money. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a very important distinction, I think. Then you see, then the reserves I mentioned, 7.3 million, have not been used in the past 2 years, probably longer than that. And I think I've covered everything on that slide. Next slide. So here are our recommendations to summarize this section. And then, as we said, we would take questions and public comment before we move to the next item. So just a summary of what we've already stated. We're recommending at this point that the Finance Subcommittee recommend to the full council that we reallocate 1.8 million in capital funds, and you saw the list of projects, to the general fund. It would go into what's called the unassigned category or undesignated. It's right in the same place as reserves, but it's unassigned to anything specific. There are very specific definitions of reserve types. There's committed, there's non-committed, there's unassigned, there's different categories that are best generally accepted county principles. These are principles that Ken works with that are handed down to us. And so by going into unassigned initially, that's where the money would be there then to fill the $3.1 million gap. So that's why that's the right place to put it. So that's 1.8. Second recommendation is to reallocate the 480 I mentioned from the capital fund meant to be used for bike trails to the general fund unassigned, again, for the 3.1. And then the third recommendation deals with what I was talking about in terms of when to go to the reserve and how much. And this, again, is a policy decision discussion for the council. Our recommendation is that we come forward with a policy and include this stipulation. The reserve for the Economic Uncertainty Fund and the operational reserve, we amend those policies so that when the two are taken together, currently 7.3 million, we would not dip below 21% of operating expenses without invoking reductions in workforce. So this is the question the mayor came up with about, hey, if we're cutting all supplies, then employees don't, yes, it has to be a balance. We have to look at capital, we have to look at supplies, we have to look at people. We have to. And so this gives some guidance for the council to decide when we would go to that step. And this is a recommendation. This should be discussed, talked about, brought to the council, And this is, yeah, where we really make some hard decisions about next year. Again, the idea here is that we can't take the reserves down to zero. At least you could actually, and some cities will be. Some cities will be using all their reserves, I guarantee you. Our recommendation is more conservative than that. We recommend that you should not use all your reserves, because what if there's a second crisis? What if the county doesn't pay us our property tax revenue on time? So we believe we have to set a trigger, and we calculated it at 75 days of burn rate, 75 days of operating expenses. That's what 21% calculates to. So right now, in hard numbers, that 7.3 million is 42%. So essentially, you'd be going through half of the 7.3 with this recommendation. So I just wanted to throw that up there. Those are our 3 recommendations. The question was asked, are there more options? This is obviously a very tough discussion to have. There are definitely more options for next year because we have more time. For this year, it gets really tough. We have to close the books June 30th. That's only 2.5 months away. This happened very quickly. Again, that's why we have reserves. The default option is to use reserves. Any options we can come up with to avoid using reserves should be discussed, and as a matter of policy, making cuts, as we've discussed, using capital, as we've discussed. One idea that I've heard and people have talked about is, well, we might have some assets we could sell. That should always be looked at too. And one asset that comes up from time to time is the property the city owns at 555 Kelly. And so the question is, well, could that be, that's a one-time influx of funds. And certainly that's an option. That's another option, that property could be sold and the proceeds from that sale could be used in this mix of options. So if that was done, then maybe you wouldn't have to defer as much capital or so forth or so on. So there's options here, but there's not many between now and June 30th. There really aren't. If there were more, I would certainly have brought them forward. So with that, I'll conclude at this moment, Mr. Mayor, and turn it back to you.
All right. Let's see. Debbie, do you want to? I have a bunch of questions I've been writing down as he's been going through. I'm sure you do as well. Do you want to go to the public first and hear their questions first and let the public go, or do you want to go through ours first?
Well, I've asked a lot of my questions. I have a couple more I'd like to ask first before going to the public.
Yep, exactly. Please proceed.
And one of them is about the reallocation of $480,000 from the CSG settlement. So what would be the impact of that? I'm guessing none, because we haven't identified any projects for the use of those funds. And originally it was going to be to repave the portion between Seymour and Wavecrest Road, which is, I think, expendable. But can you just address that quickly?
John?
So yes, John here. We were planning to allocate a portion of that to actually doing a repair of that segment of the trail between Seymour and Wavecrest. That becomes, I think, a little more important, particularly as we look at moving forward with the Highway 1 South project, the signal and the new bike connections across Highway 1. But that would be a delay, and we weren't ready to move forward with that at this point anyway. So we can look at reprogramming potentially next fiscal year a portion of that toward that project. The other piece that we were hoping to use this funding for was to reconstruct the parallel trail at Poplar along the Poplar Access Way. That was the other piece that we were hoping to use this funding for. So those were the two projects that would be delayed and paused at this moment in time. Neither of which are able to move forward, really, just in terms of the COVID-19 issue. Anyway, the Poplar Parallel Trail is really tied to the EIR And we have put a delay on that till at least March, moving forward with any work on that. So the bottom line is that we were looking at probably a year to 18-month delay on actually replacing that segment anyway. So the implications are not significant, frankly.
Well, I'll bring up questions on that topic in just a few minutes. But go ahead, Debbie. You can continue.
Yeah, so my other question before public comment was, what's the impact of like defunding the general plan, the LCP update, which I'm not in favor of, but I'd like to know what the impact of that would be.
Sure, I'll take that. I don't think Ms. Ekus is here. So that's an example. And as we said, when we come forth in May 5th, we'll show how much was left on that particular project. So we did not, in the numbers you saw earlier, we left, I think, almost 100,000 for that effort. And Jill believes that that's enough to keep her process going for now.
Okay, thank you.
For myself, so that 480 that we won from the CSG settlement, let's dig into that one while it's still fresh in everybody's. So the reason, and correct me if I'm wrong, the reason we won that settlement was because the bike path that was put down there was deemed so bad and faulty that it would obviously was not done correctly, that we could win this settlement. And we had deemed ourselves, I think when we did it, we said we had 3 years left before that thing completely fell apart. Is that correct?
John here. I don't think that we ever reached that point of putting a time frame on it. Clearly, the argument and the reason I think there was settlement on the issue was that the two parties agreed that they had failed to follow normal and standard procedures that were required in our bid documents, and as a result, that trail was built at a substandard level to what the specifications were. We have subsequently filled. We did a filling of the cracks, crack sealing, and some work out there to deal with it. Is it perfect? No. Will it convey bikes and pedestrians through there? Yeah. And again, we will come back to it. We can also come back with next year and talk about what exactly we would propose to do there and how much that would cost. And we can make then again that decision on how much and how important that piece is in the mix.
Yeah, because my sense of recollection is that we didn't dig down far enough or provide enough concrete, and we felt like it was basically going to turn into, it was just going to waste away over time.
The main issue was that they imported for almost all of that trail. They imported soil in, and most of it came from the old Carnoustie, the phase one, the first project Carnoustie, which was heavily and a lot of clay in it, and so that clay has expansive, shrink expanse characteristics to it. And so what we have there, and why we have some of the cracks, is that they put poor soil down and didn't test it. So that becomes the issue, is that they just didn't test it. Again, that is it perfect? No. Is it passable? Yes. Did they build it wrong and not to spec? Yes. And will it have the same 20 to 30 year lifespan that the rest of those trails will have? No. But we can come in at much less than what we were anticipating to have to reconstruct it to the specifications and make it last, and so it will be fine and passable.
Well, you guys are gonna start to understand one of my key elements of this whole process is, and obviously this can be opposite other council members, but I would love to be able. I think there's tremendous opportunity for us at the end of this cycle, whenever that time period is. But if we have cash on hand at the end, projects that we previously couldn't get one bid for, now we might be able to get 10 bids, and at a lower price point. So I'm trying to figure out like how to do that, because for instance, like affordable housing, there may be a good possibility at the end of this that there's a way to get a good affordable housing project going, because but only if we have funds to move on that opportunity. And I think you guys understand where I'm going with that mindset. Not everybody looks at it that way, but I'm looking at it more from a business perspective of, we have a big bang for the buck if we have anything left over at the end to be able to then use moving forward. If we use up all our money now, we won't have that opportunity. And then we'll just be right back in where everybody else is doing all this construction and we can't get bids on things. So
Mr. Mayor, I completely agree with you. The construction industry is taking a hit. They're going to take more of a hit. That opportunity, in my humble opinion, is not just going to be a short window, say 6 months. You got to get your bids while they're cheap. It's going to be a 3 to 4 year window. It's going to take a big hit. And as you say, that translates to a competitive environment among contractors and potential and cheaper project costs for us. That's
Bob,
not going to be just 6. That's going to be several. That could be several years if we go into this protracted downturn that's predicted.
Bob, can I also say this? We absolutely agree that there's some market opportunity here. I think we'll talk about that Tuesday night with a project that you're aware of. But beyond that, here's why we're not convinced entirely that the market, that right now and even in the foreseeable future that we're going to get that much of a bump in the market condition, is that what we're looking at this point is really the labor piece. Materials cost are the materials cost, and right now they have not yet been kind of coming down. Tariffs still exist on steel, a major contributor to cost. There are a lot of things and everything with that. So there are multiple pieces to every capital project. Labor obviously being one of those, and other projects on their list. but the materials still remain a big factor in that, and we think that's going to take some time for the market to react and actually come down. And that is consistent with what happened in the Great Recession. It took a while for the bottom to hit when it came down to materials. And so I think I can't agree with Bob more on this issue, that the bottom and the market opportunity is not so much now, but it's going to be in the future, perhaps.
yes, go ahead, Debbie. I still have a bunch to say, but yeah, go ahead.
So I certainly agree with John on the materials aspect, but I think looking back to what happened with the hurricanes, right? So the response to that was major infrastructure investment in the affected areas. Where did all the contractors go? They went to Texas, Louisiana, etc. So we have a disaster here. We have talk of the state of a infrastructure stimulus bond. We have the federal government talking about the same. I don't think we can count on lower bids necessarily. I think if the pool of money looks like it's big out there, I'm guessing that people are going to hold their cards until they see what's going on. So I just want to make sure that we're not, taking, low bids to the bank here, because I think there's a lot of different factors at play.
No, and I think we're ways out from that as is. I'm just saying when the time comes, I agree that it's not any time in the near term whatsoever. And it may be a ways out. I just would like to have some money on hand when it does change. I think there will be opportunity. I think there are cities in worse financial situations than we are and will not be able to act as quickly as we can as things turn around. They might not be worse off in terms of the revenue coming into their city like we are, because we're so heavily reliant on the TOT, but they are worse off in how well they've insulated themselves with their reserves like we have. So that's what I'm saying there. So here we go. So let me get into a couple of different topics here. So, you know, let me just start off by saying that I love, you know, the staff we have currently is, you know, such a great staff, and we've done such a fantastic job building it, having all the right people hired in place, all good. And I appreciate Bob's, like, you know, his noble goal of really trying to protect staff, a very good staff, a staff that we all want to protect and to keep you know, to keep here in Half Moon Bay, to keep servicing this wonderful community. Everybody I talk to across the board says, you know, what a great staff we have, and is appreciative of how much people are responsive and friendly, and we're doing all the right things right now. And, you know, I've talked to other people that have worked in the city for years, and that have managed the city for years. And, you know, there's general consensus that we're in a very good spot with staff right now. So I just want to throw that out there and appreciate that aspect. And Bob, I think you've done a noble job, you know, really trying to protect staff as much as possible with, I guess, what these recommendations are, because I don't see anything in there with regards to any of our other cuts that might be associated. And I'm not entirely sure, you know, I've been trying to, I study into what your role is, Bob, with our city. And I know one huge aspect of your goal is to, you know, protect this very good staff that's been built in all the different aspects. And I don't know as much if your mindset is to like balance out the budget in the best interest of Half Moon Bay and its taxpayers, which is kind of like a different, even though the same exact kind of scenario, a little bit of a different twist on that. And my perspective is obviously, I am here to support the taxpayers of Half Moon Bay and make sure that they are getting the best bang for their taxpayer buck regardless. And that's what I am tasked to do. Whether that be, you know, 100% supporting staff, 100% supporting, you know, the CIP or the capital improvement program, or some variation of a balance of the two in some way, shape, or form. And so obviously we are acting right now in a, you know, we can no longer think pre-COVID any longer. We are, you know, this is a post, we've got COVID, everything's changed. Obviously the finances of the city, which were just pretty rosy not even that long ago, have changed drastically. And so, you know, everything's changed. And my perspective is I would rather make less painful cuts now to avoid drastic cuts later on. I don't want to get to the point where all of a sudden we have to make drastic cuts and we feel major pushback from the city in terms of the services we offer. Whereas if we can do a little cutbacks now, you know, we might not have to do the drastic ones eventually. That may just be differences in how we approach, but I would love to see options on different ways to kind of like slash different pieces to get further along, so we don't have to all of a sudden run through everything and then make a drastic cut. And so, you know, that's why I would love for this particular topic, your recommendations, to have more options in it than this, because I mean, the way I look at this is I either agree with this or I don't, and that's my only option at this point, which I find difficult for my role to deal with.
Mr. Mayor, can I respond at this point before you go to the next point?
Please.
So yeah, I just want to make everything you say, we got it, and we hear that, and we will incorporate that into how we bring options and information forward at the future meetings as we approach June. Yeah. I just wanted to distinguish again for you and also for all the members watching, these recommendations are simply to get us through June 30th. These are what I would call like stopgap, we have a big problem type recommendations. What we have not shown here, you're right, is all of our recommendations for next year. I showed a $6 million gap, and I didn't show how we're going to deal with that $6 million gap yet. We showed a little bit, but we didn't show everything yet. So you're right, and we wanted to go a step at a time. And you mentioned labor, and absolutely that is on the table. I want to say that unequivocally. At the last meeting, the council gave us direction to enter into discussions with our two unions. And so we're doing that. And we will be back in closed session with council on Tuesday to further those discussions. And we will take direction from the council accordingly on what we should be talking to the unions about. There are a lot of things that can be discussed. There are concessions the unions could make in terms of their benefits and salaries. A group of things I would call kind of minor things, but we should discuss those things. There's furloughs, and of course there's layoffs. And so they kind of go in order in terms of the impact. But I just wanted to acknowledge your point that it's not that that's not an option. It is an option. And we've been directed to have these discussions with the union, and we will report back to the council in closed session.
And just so I'm clear, and maybe our Catherine, our lawyer, can come in here, but like, I do realize that there are certain things that we cannot talk about in public. Are we allowed to talk about options for, overall options of how that, of like, let's just say, a furlough of some sort? Are we allowed to talk about that publicly or not? Or can you give me the gauge of perspective on how deep we can go into any of those conversations in the public?
So I would suggest, in sort of a matter of timing, that you give that direction first to your labor negotiator. At this point is city manager and admin services director, so that they can actually formally do any meet and confer with the unions first before any decision or public statements are made. At this point, I don't think those any discussions have been formally initiated. So I would recommend, waiting in terms of further direction that any public statements. I guess I would see if our admin services director has any further follow-up from the HR perspective.
No, Catherine, you're absolutely correct. We began a preliminary discussion with one of the labor groups, but if I think we need to talk about this in closed session, we can't actually, as it would be a representation of bad faith, talk about anything that we need to put in front of them first before we talk about it publicly.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll just leave it there then. And then why? Yeah. So, okay. So thank you. I had to get back on topic. Create policy, the reserve. So you're suggesting, Bob, let me just see if I understand this correctly. Your recommendation is to take our reserves moving forward again, down to basically, we will take it as far down as to 21%. So we're going to use 79% of our total reserves. Is that correct?
Mr. Mayor, no, not quite. We're not using 79%. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's 21% of our operating expenses. So I'm simply stating as a percentage of operation, how low we should go. That's what that is. So if our operating expenses are, say, 10 million, 21% is 2.1 million. If our operating expenses are 20 million, 21% is 4.2 million. So it varies depending on what our operating expenses are. That's what we're saying.
Okay. And our operating expenses will obviously change.
They change.
If somebody leaves our staff and moves somewhere else or something like that, the operating is going to consistently change, correct?
Absolutely. And the theory is that you want this to be a percentage, because if we were a bigger city, we want the reserve to grow proportionately with our operating budget. So we do want it to be proportional. If we're smaller, our reserve doesn't need to be as big. If we're a big city like San Francisco, you need a much bigger number. So it's not appropriate to tie it to a number. It's appropriate to tie it to a percentage of your operating budget. Right now, though, for rough to the comparison, as I said, we have 7.3 right now, which as a percentage of our existing operating budget happens to be 42%. So coincidentally, our recommendation is half of that. So as of today, our recommendation would be going down to taking half of the 7.3 million.
And what is the disadvantage to go? I mean, I understand where you're coming from to try to mend everything so quickly. And I realize we're bleeding. If we're a patient, blood's coming out all over the place, and we're trying to put, Band-Aids on and try to do all the thing. Why are we not going into the reserves immediately? Why are we deciding to take it all from the capital funds as opposed to just going right into reserves immediately? What's the rationale?
Clearly an option. Let me make that clear, because at several points during our presentation so far, you have mentioned, hey, what are our options? What are the options? Absolutely, that is an option. This is
why are you not advocating for it, I guess?
I believe we're going to have to do both, because I'm looking to next year. And next year we have a $6 million challenge. And so for me, in terms of my advice on the priority order, I would recommend doing the step in capital before going into the reserve. But that's a fair discussion. Like I said, it's the default option. So it's there to be used, and it could be done.
And so, because I would want to see personally, just so you guys know, that back to that list of all the projects, I would love to understand from John, or possibly even yourself, just, what the priority of each one is again, and maybe look at grabbing a little bit more from our reserves right away to keep one or two of those projects still happening. There are a couple that are ones that I think are personally more valuable to the city than others, but that might not match up with what John and you believe, which would give me different insight. So I'd love to go through that together at some point.
Absolutely. We have time to do that between now and May 5th.
Okay. And why
the full council will want to weigh in on priorities as well.
Don't you think? Yeah. And then the other piece, why is it that we I mean, I know this, but just so the public, myself, and I realize I don't know government inside and out. I come from the private industry. We move at a different pace, all the different pieces. Why are we waiting so long to act on all this stuff? Why is it just give me a sense of, because May 5th is a long ways away.
Mr. Mayor, we could schedule a special meeting if that's the desire of the council. We could.
Okay, very good. Debbie, any other questions, Councilwoman Ruddock, before I move to the public?
I just want to point out that I think next year is our tough year. I'd be reluctant to dig into the reserves this year, especially given the menu of projects and the fact that we're only taking pieces of those project budgets that could be done without this year. Those to me don't strike me as essential public works projects. Might be nice to have some of those, like you said, your favorites, but I think that life next year is probably going to be very bad, and I think we're going to want to reserve our reserves for the decisions that we have to make in the coming fiscal year, as opposed to the balance of this fiscal year.
Okay. All right, very good. Let's go to public comment. Jessica, you got it all teed up for us?
Yes. So any of our attendees, if you would like to address the subcommittee during this public comment portion, go ahead and use the raise your hand feature. If you open the participants list on your Zoom app, then you'll be able to raise your hand and I'll go through in order. So I also have a few emails that I'll read after we take live public comments. The first speaker will be, oops. Matthew Daytone. Matthew, go ahead.
Very good. Thank you very much, staff and City Council, Mayor Eisen. So I'm from business as well, and I just wanted to understand generally the biggest portions of my budget are cut first, and I just wanted to understand that what is our monthly burn rate from a city perspective, and perhaps what's the biggest portion of that monthly burn rate. And it would seem to me that we should attack the biggest pies first, because I also feel like this is going to be, as you said, Mr. Nesbitt, this is also going to be a protracted 3 to 4 year challenge. And if we don't make cuts now and do some bold moves today, we're going to have to make much bigger cuts in the future. And it feels like, maybe like our Parks and Recs department, or, perhaps that's a great opportunity to look at. And maybe a furlough, as you might suggest. And I understand our unemployment benefits are very strong right now. And so perhaps instead of us paying them, they could get unemployment benefits that wouldn't impact our income or balance sheet.
And Bob, do you want to answer this? I know you and I have talked about some of these topics directly already. So do you want to be able to address that?
Sure, Mr. Mayor. I don't have our burn rate handy. We can certainly try to couch our data in that way when we come back on May 5th. But our operating budget is for this year is about 17.5 million. So, you can kind of quick and dirty do it that way. In terms of the big pie, I think the speaker is alluding to labor costs. Absolutely, they are big. Our cost for regular employees is about 26% of our operating budget. Our cost for the sheriff contract is 17% of our operating budget. So they're big pieces. There's no doubt about it. There's big pieces. And as I indicated, when I put up the challenge for next year, we have to look at that. And as we said, as you start to cut back in various ways, whether it's furlough or layoffs or whatever you do, that equates to less service delivery. The difference, of course, between government and the private sector is we are charged with reallocating very precious taxes. The taxes are from the community, and those are turned back to the community in terms of services that the community demands. And so in this time right now, we have a very unfortunate situation where we have to both make cuts at a time when our city community needs government the most. Right now, we are spending almost all of our time, 42 staff. We've put aside elective projects and normal programs and park and rec programming because we are all not 100%, 80, 85% working on responding to the COVID-19 challenge in front of us. And we are constantly communicating with the public, following up on complaints, working with our county partners. So it is a conundrum that we are we have committed employees, as the mayor said, and we're doing everything now, yet we have this financial challenge where the speaker is correct. It's hard to do the math and not see that we have to look at that portion of our budget.
Thank you.
Good back and forth. Thank you, guys.
Next, we have Virginia Tourism. Virginia, go ahead.
Jessica, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank you all and commend you. I think everything that you have stated today in the presentation and the Q&A are spot on. You're taking this, I do agree in terms of you need immediacy and urgency when these types of issues occur. The first and foremost thing is stopping as much variable expense as you can. I think that's always the first cut that you should do. So I actually agree with the types of projects and the excesses for the balance of this year. Let me shift for a moment, if you would listen to me with respect to the revenue side of the equation. I am very strongly in favor of a 555 Kelly sale of that property. And also want to question you as to whether or not you're looking into any state contributions that may be earmarked for COVID-19 for municipalities. One suggestion I have is also on the revenue side of the equation, perhaps expanding the parking lot, doubling or tripling it here at Poplar, and perhaps putting in a tiered use fee and a gate requiring credit card and cash payments. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. If you added 100 spots at an average of $10 a day, you could, over 6 months, just from weekend use, get about $50K of additional revenue. I'd also start looking into parking fines, greater fines for stop sign abuse, and fines for alcohol on the beach. I think quite often in times like this, when people are abusing things, we should be very strict and disciplined. So, I'll leave it at that. But I commend you for understanding the gravity of the situation and looking for immediate responses. And I do agree with Councilwoman Ruddock that next year is going to be this significant challenge in terms of the budget. I think you can deal with the next few months here. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. The next public speaker, Pez 4A. Go ahead.
I'm on?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. All right. So no, it's Paulette Eisen.
Oh, okay. Hi, Paulette.
Just to clarify. All right. So, by the way, I think the Zoom thing is much better than any other meeting we've had so far. So I'm really happy we're using this. But I just want to, obviously we are in a very, very dire situation financially for the town. Moving forward now, it's just amazing that just in a few months, everything unravels so quickly, and that we're looking at important projects and infrastructure things that we are not going to obviously see materialize in at least 4 years or so before there's enough money, if we're going to drain all our reserves, that there's enough money to go back into any kind of budget for all these important projects. So it's dire. What does that mean? To me, that means we move quickly. We don't keep looking into things and delaying things. We move quickly to try to stem the bleeding, because that's what we're doing right now. We're bleeding money. And I've seen other cities, many other cities, that are in our situation, especially those that depend so heavily on the tourist trade for their revenue, that they have already laid off or furloughed lots of staff, because that's an obvious huge expense. Bob just said it's 25% of revenue goes to staffing. So that's clearly a big a big barrel that we need to reduce, and has always been reduced in times of recession or need or down or economic downturn. Well, this is our huge economic downturn that we, in best case scenario, as I say, will maybe come out of in 4 years. So as far as I'm concerned, we need to move much more quickly than we're moving. I think it's been incredibly slow. I do feel we've been dragging our feet. I know if I don't have money coming in, I change my habits and whole scene immediately and make severe changes to how anything I buy, anything I do, I make those changes. I feel that we have not been making those changes quickly enough. As far as I'm concerned, after the March 17th City Council meeting, the talks with the unions should have been happening right then and there. And given how big a portion this part of the budget is, I can't believe that this hasn't been presented in today's discussions as an option of how it is, what happens if we reduce our workforce, or if we put people on furlough, with what all of the combination of things that we can do to that barrel, that isn't part of the presentation today as an option of how to move forward out of this. So no, I don't think there's any time for delay. I don't even like the idea of, like, it sounds like we want to delay this really to do anything about this part of it until at least we go into next year's budget. I don't believe we should be delaying it. I think anytime we can cut expenses immediately, as quickly as possible, we at least move ourselves forward to a little less pain with what we're going to have to deal with in next year's budget, because it's going to be clearly very painful. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Paulette. The next speaker is Libby Leiden.
Oops. Hi, guys. So I had a question about salary and benefits. And I was wondering if there's talk to still give pay increases to employees going forward, or what's the discussion around that?
Bob, you want to, or does somebody want to address that? I know we've kind of addressed that a little bit as a.
Sure, Libby. I'll follow up with you separately if you don't mind on that question.
Okay.
Okay. Next public speaker is Julie's Daytome. Julius, are you there? Okay, I think that's it. So I'll go to our emailed comments. The first is from Daniel McMillan. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the HMB City Council and HMB City staff for stepping up during this crisis, doing all that you do to keep our city running. I know that this has required lots of extra hours of work and stress on your part. Again, thank you for that. My concerns and input on the city budget for remainder of this fiscal year and the next fiscal year. 1, it is very likely that COVID-19 is going to severely reduce city revenues for the foreseeable future as the city is projecting. 2, when cutting spending, it seems very likely that all departments will need to make cuts in order to achieve a balanced budget, as discussed at last week's council meeting. 3, the budget for capital improvements, I believe referred to as CIP, will no doubt be affected and reduced. However, I strongly believe that the CIP should be reduced as little as possible, since those investments on actual physical projects are vital to our city's infrastructure, safety, and quality of life. 4, the city should furlough some of the city staff for several months, and the sooner the better, in order to help us reach a balanced budget. These would not be terminations, they would be furloughs, and the furloughed staff would be eligible to receive unemployment compensation through the state of California. In my opinion, this is a much better option for reducing spending than reducing spending on CIP. Thank you for your attention. The next public comment is from Richard Parness. I have read the Finance Subcommittee agenda for this meeting, including the attached PowerPoint presentation and the related article in the HMB Review on April 15th. I am a retired CPA with 40 years work experience in both the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. My comments concern the city's approach to managing its finances and budget in light of the coronavirus pandemic. I appreciate the city taking steps to deal with the shortfalls in revenue during this fiscal year as well as the next fiscal year. Further, I don't believe that we will return to any semblance of normal life until sometime after a vaccine has been developed and disseminated to the public. This will take at least a year or two, probably longer. Accordingly, I have deep concern that the city is not taking severe enough actions to deal with its diminished revenues. Most specifically, I noted that city employees are being kept on payroll. Payroll represents a substantial portion of the city's budget. While I recognize the economic and social problems stemming from the coronavirus are substantial, and I appreciate the city's efforts not to add to problems by keeping its employees on payroll, I have deep concerns that using our precious dollars in this manner will significantly impair its ability to address normal responsibilities of the city. Further, this will impair the city's ability to deal with other issues that will arise. Reappropriating dollars from other budget areas, assuming that such action is even legal, will further diminish the city's ability to serve its residents. I am concerned that the city is using a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Please reconsider your actions and take a hard look at the longer-term implications of your actions. Thank you for considering my comments. The next speaker, next public comment via email is from David Oblovi. In the city's agenda packet on page 3, the staff report states that staff is estimating that the city will have a $3.1 million revenue shortfall before going on to say that we estimate a deficit of $2.4 million. These two statements do not appear to align with the currently in play 2019-2020 budget, and I am deeply concerned that the magnitude of the deficit we are facing this year either isn't being accurately described or is not fully understood. The budget projects revenues of $17.455 million, which means a revenue shortfall of $3.1 million would net to actual revenues of $14.3 million. This is set against projected expenditures of $20.154 million. The takeaway from that data is that the city is facing a net deficit not of $2.4 million, but instead of $5.85 million. Yet the staff report claims $2.4 million. If during the meeting, staff could clarify this disconnect, and if the committee members could follow up and help to get clarity, it would be helpful to the community to better understand what we are facing. Thank you for your time and hard work in these difficult times.
Does somebody want to comment to that one? That one is that's a new wrinkle. I don't entirely understand what he's even saying or asking.
Mr. Mayor, I can try, and then if either Lisa or Ken want to jump in, they can feel free. And we can certainly, we're making a note to make sure this is clear at the next meeting. I believe the difference between the 17.5 figure approximately of the operating budget and the 20 figure is the $3 million that was devoted to capital. That's the difference. So everything we presented today takes that into account. So our recommendation to pull 1.8 million back, that is a portion of that 3 million that was devoted to capital when the budget was approved, and is the difference between the operating budget and the complete budget, which is when you add operating and capital to get together. There's also transfers back and forth that sometimes make that math a little more confusing in terms of demonstrating how the budget is balanced. But I can certainly speak with the speaker offline, and we'll make sure we're clear on that at the next meeting. Anything to add, Lisa or Ken? Nope.
maybe we should just address that very clearly in the next staff report that comes out as well, just so
Point taken.
I'm 100% clear on it, I guess.
I do have one more comment. This is from Roy Saloom. I commend the city for looking at the budget now in a proactive fashion. These are difficult choices to make, yet it's the appropriate and smart thing to do now. Comment 1. Councilwoman Reddick mentioned triage with respect to CIP. To that point, are the list of projects listed on the PowerPoint slide in order of priority, or is that ranking yet to be determined? What will be the criteria for ranking these projects? Comment 2. TOT is generated from visitors spending their discretionary income. In the current environment, much of the population's discretionary income has been redirected toward paying bills. People are now going heavily into debt. When a recovery comes, people will service their personal debt before they begin any substantial discretionary spending. This means that the recovery of TOT income from visitors to the coast side will lag well behind other sources of revenue. It also means that a recovery of TOT revenue will likely take longer, perhaps years. If that is what is likely to happen, then the city's budget forecast should not count on a TOT income returning to previous levels for some time, perhaps for several years. Comment 3. I agree with Bob and the mayor. Because of the economic downturn, real estate values and construction costs will be in flux. Because of the downturn, there may be unique one-time opportunities to leverage reserve funds to create affordable housing. This might be accomplished through purchases of property, partnerships with property owners, or incentives. I encourage the council and staff to look for any of these opportunities in the coming year to take advantage of a potentially competitive environment. Let's be ready and smart if a good deal comes along. Comment 4. If there is a reduction of visitors to the coastside, then housing units that have been previously used for Airbnb rentals may return to long-term housing. There may be an opportunity to encourage the permanent transition of these units to housing through policy or an ordinance. Comment 5. Can the city convert the servicing of the library debt to a lower interest rate? Comment 6. I do not favor the selling of assets to make the budget work. That's too short-sighted. Comment 7. The general plan update should be considered a priority project. Too much time, effort, and public participation has gone into completing it. Getting it finally done and out of the way will resolve a lot of uncertainty in the community going forward. And there is one more comment, but it's related to 880 Stonepine, so I'll wait to read that until we get to that item.
Well, thank you, public, for participating. That's the great comments overall. And I love the diversity of different perspectives. Very good. So thank you all for participating. It's a lot of different diverse information there. Debbie, do you want to approach anything else on this topic before we move on, or have any final words, Councilwoman Ruddock?
I don't. I do appreciate the public input. I'm glad people are paying attention and communicating. That's very valuable. Other than that, I don't have much to say until we deal with the next topic. I would like to take a 5-minute rest stop, if we could, between now and the discussion of Stonepine.
Very good, very good. And let me just close this topic off by yeah, thank you guys for putting all the work into creating this. These are tough times, and I do appreciate the fact that everybody's spending the time to look at it so closely to try to make sure that we are doing, again, I look at it like what's overall best for the city, and I hope all of us do as well. Boom. Let's take a 5-minute recess, and what time is it now? Let me see. Where's on my watch or my phone, it says 1:20, or it says 1:19, but I'm just going to go with 1:20. How about we reconvene at 1:25? You guys good with that? All right, I'm going to stay on. I'm just going to stay on and mute myself. I assume everybody else will in 5 minutes. Okay, let's wait just a minute.
I'm here. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, okay. And we might not totally need you for this anyways. Just wanted to make sure we're all back. Are we okay starting, Bob? Do you feel okay, comfortable starting back up at this point?
We could just progress the slide.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We'll get started again. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the subcommittee. So this next item is a separate item, but it is related because it certainly is a cost item and a need item and a service level item. So it does relate in that aspect. This first slide, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew and John Dowdy in a second. The purpose of this item is to talk about financing the acquisition of 880 Stone Pine. The council has already entered into a purchase agreement for this acquisition, and we're in escrow. That was done obviously before we were in the situation we're in now. And so this makes for interesting challenges related to what we were just talking about. But we are in escrow, and we are now looking into the best way to finance the acquisition. That said, we thought it would be important before we talked about financing to talk a little bit about the need of this acquisition and the need of this facility, because we think that's very relevant to the conversation. Before we just start talking numbers, we wanted to kind of take a step backward with the council and go back to when we recommended purchasing this property in the first place, and just kind of re-summarize that point. And before I turn it over to Matthew or John, I just want to state that as we saw in the last presentation and discussion, these choices are not in a vacuum. The decision to pursue this acquisition is not in a vacuum. We're at this point now with the challenges that we have that everything now is a choice. If we spend money on capital, then maybe we don't spend money on labor. If we spend money on labor, then we don't spend money on capital. Everything is a choice. So it's not so much just in a vacuum, is this a good idea? It's how does this compare to other choices that we have to make? It has to be looked at through that lens. Everything is a choice, and it has to be looked at, is this expenditure, because if we make this expenditure, obviously that's at the risk of not making another expenditure. So I just wanted to remind everyone of the opportunity cost that's involved here. We're spending precious resources. Those resources are going down. We know that. We have to make tough choices. And the question is, how does this choice stack up to other choices? So with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew and John just to kind of go through a little more detail why this is such an important need for what we consider to be our core, part of our core essential services.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you, council members. I'm presenting this. I've been the lead for the city on this project since council gave direction to pursue it a couple of years ago. It's been a long road, and hopefully this sheds some light on why we continue to talk about it. We know that this is a concern in the community. There are people wondering why we would consider this in light of everything else that's going on. And what we hope to do is at least share our thinking and why we think it's really important. And ultimately, the council has tough decisions to make, but we think the information you're presented today will help you understand why we continue to prioritize this. So first of all is the general need. A corporation yard is critical to any operation of a city and any public agency, for the most part, that does any sort of construction or infrastructure work. The corporation yard is critical in that it houses our construction materials, our vehicles, our equipment, all of which should be, each of those is an asset that needs investment and protection, because that's how we serve the community very, very directly in the work that happens through Public Works. When there are major construction projects, this is the location that materials are stored at and staged at in preparing to build, as well as materials are removed. This is where they're stored and staged before ultimate disposal. We have maintenance workers that are all around town collecting garbage at public facilities, and this is where that garbage goes and is sorted and prepared for pickup by Republic. When the Public Works team has maintenance projects that require staging and assembly, this is where it happens. It's a very, very busy site. There's a lot happening at all times. It's also a place where we store large pieces of equipment and goods for the city. There are many trailers out there that store emergency preparedness supplies. We store other pieces of equipment there. We have community partners that store equipment and materials there as well. It should be a safe and secure location for many of the city's needs to be serviced from. So in any circumstance, a city needs a corporation yard as a place to store and stage materials, equipment, and we have several staff, our maintenance staff, that work out of this location, and they need a home where they can store their equipment. They can have meetings that often involve large plans and materials. They meet with contractors, and this property serves that purpose. Before I go on with that, John, do you have any other things you want to add about the need just in general for a corporation yard?
I think you've covered it well, but I will also suggest some operational issues which have to be considered. At this point, we have a facility that doesn't meet Americans with Disabilities Act requirements, which is an obligation that we have and could place us in an awkward position should a member of the public or a member of our staff take issue or have a need. And basically, using the old ranch house as it stands today, it would be impossible, virtually impossible, to meet many of the standards and requirements of that. We currently have only male maintenance workers, and that's just the nature of how applications have gone. In my time, I cannot recall actually having a female job applicant. That will change, just as it's changed in the nature of fire and police over the decades. And we have no provision for changing areas, for a locker room, all of the things that relate to that issue in terms of having a female individual person on that site. So in addition to needing to have materials stored, vehicles stored out of the tough coastal air and environment, we also have needs for storing hazardous waste and not hazardous waste, but hazardous materials, and sometimes the hazardous waste out of those. And we're required by law to have those in a contained area and specific areas. So there are a number of operational issues that we are basically just getting by with because we were simply in a lease situation, but have an absolute need, both functionally as well as legally, to meet some of those obligations and standards that we currently are not.
Thank you, John. As we have established, a city needs a corporation yard for a variety of reasons. It's not just a parking lot for vehicles. It is a crucial space that's used for a lot of different functions, where, as mentioned before, the city provides one of its core services, which is infrastructure and maintenance. On top of that, we've been located at 880 Stone Pine Road for about 10 years. We leased that property from Post. We won't get into the history of that situation, but it is a leased situation, and we pay them every month for the right to use the property. And going back to 2 years ago, Post made it abundantly clear to the city that it was no longer interested in holding this property. It planned to sell the property, and they gave the city a first right of refusal to continue to lease the space and pursue an acquisition. I have spoken with Post in light of all these things going on with COVID, and it remains their intent to sell the property, and they hope to continue to work with us on an acquisition and allow us to continue renting the property. The reason this property is so important to us is twofold. One is we have very limited alternatives. The city has not had a permanent corporation yard for many, many years. This was seen as that permanent solution. History changed things a little bit, and we've been lucky to remain on this property over the last 10 years. We've explored lots of other alternatives. We need 3+ acres of land that can be used for basically an industrial function. And it would also require, again, office space for staff, storage space for materials and equipment. And the options are extremely limited on the coast. To date, we only found one real viable option, and even that was going to take some acrobatics to make work. And that leads us to the second piece of this, which is the cost of alternatives. When we look at the market cost of leasing land, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. If we're not going to purchase this, we have to lease land somewhere. The cost to lease land for this purpose and probably have to build our own facilities on any vacant land that we could find to lease. The break-even point versus an acquisition of this property is only 5 to 10 years. And so when we look at the long-term need for this type of facility for the city, the amount that we're paying now and what we would have to pay if we were to have to relocate to another facility and lease it, the investment in an acquisition now makes a lot of sense financially. And I think as we go through the presentation, you'll see what those costs look like from an acquisition standpoint. And I'm happy to share later kind of how I came to the break-even analysis.
While we're on that topic, why then didn't we buy the property earlier? Why, I mean, if we've been renting it for 10 years and we should have broke even regardless after 5 years-ish, why weren't we smart enough to see that in the future and make the acquisition?
That's a great question. I'll do my best to answer it. I cannot speak for past individuals, both council and staff. As you know, most of our staff are fairly new. Most of us have been here 3 years or less. And we have a completely different council than we did in the past. What I can say is kind of speculating is a couple of things. One, we know that we had originally purchased this property. The downfall in 2008 caused us to default on that acquisition. The Post was the lender. They financed the purchase, and that's how they ended up owning it. Post never wanted to own this in the first place. They helped the city in a tough situation and continue to be a great partner for us on this. I think the main reason earlier on that the city didn't decide to move forward with an acquisition was twofold. One, Post wasn't discussing selling the property. They were holding it, and the city was using it. Second of all, up until just 2 years ago, we weren't paying anything for the use of this property. We were managing the open space of this property for Post based on an agreement, and our corporation yard was there as part of that management, and we weren't paying any sort of fees. And then 2 years ago, they renegotiated that, and we began paying rent. Even with the rent that we pay currently and the management that we do on the property, we're still very, very far below market on our rent there. And again, that just speaks to the relationship we have with Post, with their desire to serve the community good. But they've reached a point where owning this property is no longer in their interest, and they hope for us to acquire it so that we can continue to serve the public from it.
Matthew, if I could, I think there's a third piece of the puzzle that's important for the community here. Up until 3 years ago, the city owned and still does own, but owned land next to the sewer treatment plant. That land was intended to be the location for the corporation yard. 3 years ago or thereabouts, that land was redesignated and certified as environmentally sensitive habitat by the Coastal Commission. So I think for many years leading up to that point, there was the thought clearly of developing that area clearly next to the plant. Made sense. There were kind of some, symbiosis, as you say, with that. That became also an impossibility with the designation of that property as Isha. So that was also a factor that's only led us to this point in the recent 2 to 3 year period of evaluating. And 3 years ago, we were looking at alternate sites and dealing with it because we knew at some point this was going to likely come to an end, this relationship. Frankly, as Matthew said, there are not great options and available land out there for this purpose.
All good. Thank you. Is somebody continuing or?
All right, everyone makes that mistake once, right? I have to unmute myself. My apologies. I'll take it from here. And we'll switch from the need, which you just heard, to the financing and the options there, and then we'll turn it back over to the committee. So we have 3 options we'll run through fairly quickly. Initially, pre-pandemic, we were thinking that one possibility would be to buy cash. We're in a purchase agreement for about 2.1 million, and pre-pandemic, that was certainly an option. We were also at that point kind of a cash hybrid, was maybe doing a very short-term loan, looking to the future of possible, longer-term bond financing in the future. Again, all pre-pandemic, times were good, and we had a lot of capital projects on top of this. And so we were looking long-term about options, about borrowing options that were possibly even bigger than just this. But related to that was we could have brought forward a cash option to the council. Now that is not an option in our mind at all, and we are not recommending it. Next slide. So this is kind of a starting point option, kind of a standard commercial lending type loan. So this would be through a bank. We haven't gone as far as having real detailed conversations, but this is an example of if we did it kind of through commercial lending. So what you see here, again, very rough. Our point was not to get into 15 years, 20 years, and kind of the detail of the terms and whether that interest rate is accurate. It's just a starting point. If we could get a better interest rate, we would. If it goes up, it goes up. But this just to give a rough idea. So 3.92 was a plug interest rate that Brian Lopez thought was a good starting point. Maybe he had some conversations with the bank at some particular time, and he got advice to basically divide the acquisition and the needed improvements into the 2 parts. So we show the property acquisition separately, 2.178 million, and then another million of improvements. And you heard the presentation from both Matthew and John why we need to actually fix up the site once we purchase it. So that was divided into the 2 parts where we would do a construction loan and then convert it and refund it into a package. So it's 1 year for construction and then another 15 years. Again, I don't think the details are that important, but you can see the property alone at 15 years, the debt service is 192,000. The construction of 1 million for 1 year, and then as you convert it to a longer term loan, you see the total there going on $280,000 year 2 plus if we were financing that for around 15 years. And then the final column is the interest expense that you would incur on that type of borrowing. So we wanted to show that as an example, but that's, I think, for government, the worst case scenario. As government, we can do better than that. We can do tax exempt financing, and we have other options at our disposal. So queue up option 3. So the state has what's called the iBank, where they have various programs and work with local jurisdictions to do borrowings. So we are still looking into this and having conversations with staff at the state and at the iBank to look into what program would be right for us and what would be a good fit and how it would all work and what the terms would be. But in simple terms, the interest rate would be lower. We're talking about tax exempt debt here. So we're using 2.5%. Again, just a plug interest rate at this point, could be a little higher, maybe could be a little lower. And we've shown 2 options here just for discussion purposes, a 20-year term and a 30-year term, which I believe are both available. Again, still a work in progress for us on looking into what are the best options and what they can provide to us. But you can see acquisition of the property and the needed improvements at a 20-year term, the debt service, the annual debt service around $200,000, and at a 30-year term, it's around $150,000. So as I said, we'll continue to work on those. If there's other options, we'll look at them. But clearly, as a government, going tax exempt is something we can take advantage of. We get a lower interest rate. And that then, as I said, becomes an expense and a choice. And by doing this, again, in the big picture of preparing a budget for next year where we already have a predicted deficit, it's all about deciding what the priorities are. The other last comment I would make on us kind of recommending this, this is our recommendation. We just have to do some more research and work out the details with them. I will just add that I have a feeling the iBank is busy right now, like everyone else, and they're probably putting a lot of attention to response to the crisis as well. And so I just think we have to keep that in mind, that we're approaching them for what is a very, very small loan from their point of view. But I want to just hedge this, that we're going to find out more. And, you know, if all of a sudden they're directed to turn their attention to other more pressing issues, we might go to the back of the line. I'm just a little worried about that. But we, like I said, we have a long escrow. Matthew's made contact with Post, and so we'll keep evaluating these. But we wanted to give the subcommittee just an idea of what the debt service would be in this example. So I think that might be the last slide. Is that the last slide? Yes. So Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you for questions and any more public comment.
Okay. Let's go to clarifying questions. This one I'd like to do for clarifying questions first, and then we'll open it up to the public, and then we'll come back and do our own. Let me just start out by I do want to praise you guys for taking the time and energy to work on this one. Lots of background on this one, and I appreciate you bringing it forth. I know the timing is obviously very rough to discuss this topic, but with that being said, let's move forward. Any clarifying questions, Councilwoman Ruddock?
So somebody asked that earlier. It may have been Virginia Tourism. So has staff been looking at the opportunities presented by the various stimulus initiatives in terms of qualifying for, you know, 0 or low interest loans, what have you? But I'm guessing we're tracking that pretty heavily. But if you could just confirm, you know, our engagement on this issue.
Sure, I'll take that and then let Matthew jump in. We are tracking it. I'll let Matthew jump in on that. Yeah, I think we're in a position that if an opportunity was out there, we would see it. And so we certainly won't discount any better opportunity that exists out there. I'll let Matthew jump in. I was going to make a comment after Virginia's comment, not related to Stone Pine, but just generally, yeah, she made that comment about tracking state and federal sources. Absolutely, we're doing that. I wanted to emphasize and underscore her comment that we're doing that. But on the other side of that one, I'm also worried that one goes the other way, and we're also watching the state to make sure, you know, they don't take away money from local jurisdictions as well. But with that, Matthew, anything more specific on programs that might be a fit here, or we are tracking though?
No, I think you covered it. We're tracking. We haven't identified anything yet, but it's one of the, I think, core things that we're doing right now is keeping an eye on all the changing programs and funding sources that, you know, hopefully can help the community.
So I would just recommend that we track the development of the infrastructure bond that the state has begun working on. That would be the bond that would replace the 2 climate resilience bonds that have legislation behind them currently. I participated in the county COVID conference call the other day, and Assemblymember Mullen, who's also the Speaker pro tem, said that indeed was the case. They were just beginning development on it, but I think it's going to be very important for our lobbyist, Alex Gibson, to be tracking the conversations, because they're going to be developing categories of funding, and they're going to be addressing the needs of local governments. And we want to make sure that we're as close to that table as we can be. That would be the recommendation that I would make.
Okay, and I have one question real quick. The iBank, and just for my own clarification, the options I saw up there were for purchase and construction. Can we only go through iBank for purchase and construction, or can you just also do it for purchase at the lower rate?
So this is one of the questions that we're evaluating, and the preliminary information that Mr. Lopez has received from them is construction does have to be a component of your project. So that is a question we are still evaluating, but that is the preliminary word we have gotten back.
I'd like to just follow up on that. So any grant we might get from the state or an infrastructure loan, whatever, is going to have similar criteria. That the state has a problem with just paying for things like planning and acquisition that aren't necessarily going to develop into real projects. So they want to see that they're going to give you money, that you're actually, you know, have the capacity and the laid the groundwork to actually implement the project.
And I'll just share, I think a key to that is, one, it's as has been mentioned, a likely component of this type of funding, but two, it's necessary because we've been leasing the property for such a long time without a prospect of long-term ownership, and we've been exploring other options. We need to make, there's no investment that's been made into the property other than minor maintenance and repairs. All of our vehicles, all of our equipment sit outside right now. Those are an investment in and of themselves that are really crucial to the city being able to provide core services to the community. And so we need to protect those investments. And the great thing you see with this type of a loan is the debt service is so low. It's really taking advantage of the market, as we've kind of talked about, and actually having our money go a lot farther for us right now. So ultimately, we know that there's a lot of more discussion and decisions to be made, but we think that the acquisition of this property, making those types of improvements, is in the best interest of the city and of the community. And there are going to be sacrifices that have to be made to afford something like this, and we think that's the right thing for the community.
All right. Anything else before we go to? Do we have a speaker on this topic?
I don't have any attendees with raised hands yet, but I do have one email that was sent in.
Okay, do you want to read that and then Debbie and I, Councilwoman Reddick and I can get into conversation?
Yeah, I'll read that email, and then I did just get one raised hand, so we'll go to
Okay.
that after the email.
Okay.
This comment is from Brian Jenna. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Given current events, the city of Half Moon Bay has no choice but to indefinitely postpone or cancel the possibility of purchasing the 880 Stone Pine property. Any further work toward purchasing the property at this time is a complete misuse of public funds in a time where the city budget is in serious peril. And then let me go to Matthew, go ahead. Matthew Daytome is our next speaker.
I have actually the opposite comment of that last comment. I feel like this is a long-term necessity that will be here, that was here 10 years ago, that is here today, that will be here 10 years from now. COVID is a temporary disaster. So I feel like this property for the long-term benefit of our community is absolutely necessary. But I also feel like there's maybe creative options, right? I just looked on Google Earth. It seems a very small portion of this 3 acres is actually being used today. Can we keep 2 acres and sell an acre? You know, I think the price that you saw there looked very attractive. I'm in real estate. Is there an opportunity to keep 2 acres and sell an acre and perhaps finance, you know, the construction or what have you? I think that we need to think, you know, like real estate people, and this is a real estate purchase. So I feel like it's a necessity and we can be creative. Property is a great investment long-term for our community.
Yeah, I love the mindset. Do we want to have somebody respond to that? Because I think you'll understand a little bit more about the purchasing of that. But thank you so much for your comments.
Would you like me to respond?
Yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
Just really quick, and we appreciate the comments we've heard and understand both sides of the coin here and people's concerns. In addressing the most recent speaker's question, the entire property is 20.5 acres, but due to its proximity to the creek and the old ag pond that is up on the northwestern portion of the property, and some other items on the property, the appraisal that we received as part of this acquisition process limited the amount of usable acreage to about 10 acres. And we suspect that really, and that's what we're paying for, is usable space. In the short term and in the middle term, our plan is to, you know, master plan the site and really make sure that, again, if we're purchasing this property as an investment for the community, that it is used to its maximum extent for that purpose. That's why we're acquiring it. Anything beyond that, I think, has to be in the long term and looked at down the road. I don't think we could even think about that right now.
Thank you.
That's all I have, Mayor.
Jessica,
Excellent.
I thought Roy Saloom had a comment on this.
No, the one that I just read was the comment I was holding.
Okay.
Okay. So it comes back to Councilwoman Ruddick and myself at this point.
Sorry, we did just get one more raised hand from Paulette Eisen.
All right.
Go ahead,
All
Paulette.
right, all right, thank you. So this one, you know, as much as I made my comments about what a dire financial situation we're in, I also know how little property we have in the Half Moon Bay area to find and consider for a courtyard, which to me is like essential services. So I think we have to go ahead with this purchase. Obviously, we can no longer spend the money that we would have liked to have put into it. Now we have to take it as a loan, but I think it's an essential part. I think we need to go ahead with this. And as far as the construction of needed buildings that Matthew mentioned and that John mentioned, of course, that's absolutely essential, but we need to see about the loan. This is where I appreciate your research on the loan possibility, because that is, I think, what we'd have to look at for for building anything, because right now there is no money for building. So a loan would be critical for that. That's my 2 cents. Okay, thanks.
Councilwoman Ruddock?
Yeah, so I support continuing on with the acquisition of this property and pursuing, favorable loan terms. There definitely has been ferment in the community about this, not just now because of COVID, but when we started negotiations, et cetera. There's a lot of ill will over the past regarding Post and this property and park plans previously. And some people who are opposing this, I think, are still wearing those lenses, right? So I think we're going to have to get over that. This isn't about, Post and open space and, past council members who are associated with those people. It's about providing core services that are core to our public health and safety and welfare mission. So in that light, I favor proceeding with it. We have a partner who has expressed willingness to work with us on this acquisition, given where we are right now. So we have a partner, I believe, that we can trust, and a partner who's going to be engaged in this community and that we're going to have future interactions with. So this is a relationship that's here to stay, as far as I'm concerned. And I believe it's a favorable relationship and partnership. So I favor moving ahead. I appreciated Matthew Destom's remarks about potential revenue generation. We do have 10 acres. It may be that for Sam or the school district, we might be able to lease some portion of the property to them for storage of certain public related materials. It may be this sizable site that we would have for public facilities could accommodate reusable energy infrastructure, water storage, what have you. So I agree that we ought to, be keeping an eye as we move along toward potential, revenue sources out of the use of this property for anything we're doing, I think. And Virginia Torsen, I thought, aptly brought this up too. And I really appreciated her ideas for, raising additional revenues. Thank you, Virginia. So those are really good ideas. And so I think it's a good idea. I think it's supported. I think it would be very short-sighted for us to kill this initiative. It's part of our core mission. Yes, this problem might be with us for a couple of years or maybe even up to 5 years, but hopefully we're going to be here a long time. And believe me, I've been involved in the city government for 30 years. I've seen this argument over the courtyard for 30 years. We get close, somebody opposes it, we back off. I'm not going there again, right? So I support acquisition of Stone Pine, and I want us to work with Post and government lending agencies to get us to maximize the terms, the favorable terms that we can get. But it would be wrong for us to stop here. Those are my comments.
Good. Thank you. Very good.
Mayor Eisen?
So for this one, I have a bunch of stuff to discuss. So obviously, the timing of this, unfortunately, probably couldn't be worse. And we just took sewer rates up 100% over 5 years, and now we're going to be putting this as yet another burden, really kind of like on the taxpayers in a time period where everybody wants us to be doing the opposite of what we're doing, which is raising taxes when people are hurting, and then spending money when we should be, in the ideal, cutting back. That being said, I couldn't agree with Councilwoman Ruddock more that this is something we absolutely have to do. I hate the optics of it. And I'm saddened that I have to be, a part of the optics, because ultimately my vote on this, and knowing how I think we need to move forward as well, is, against what the public is going to see. And I would love to try to figure out a PR mission to get this out to the public in a positive way, because I feel like this can be so misconstrued, as we continue to spend when, in a time period of need. But again, it is 100% an essential service. We need it. The terms of the agreement, with, Post, a great partner, have been fantastic. They have allowed us to buy the property at, a little bit below what I guess the quote unquote market rate was for it at one point. And there are concessions that we have thrown in as well to make that work for both sides. But it is not just a essential piece of property to purchase. It is also a rather favorable deal for the city, ultimately speaking. And as Matthew pointed out aptly at the start, we're going to make this up in 5 to 10 years, whatever it may be, given the certain scenarios. So, I mean, it makes sense financially as well. Again, if timing were different, it would be a slam dunk, but we definitely need to go that route. The other thing, as multiple people talked about, the property can be used for other purposes, not necessarily profitable ones, as we talk about some of the concessions that are in there. But, there is, like, for instance, the water district is in downtown Half Moon Bay, and it takes up a big portion of land right on Main Street. Like, that seems like it would be a great opportunity to move that outside of Main Street, possibly into the courtyard if we had ability to do so, and make it so Main Street had a few more lively businesses, hopefully once the economy turns, and change the way Main Street's viewed and all the different aspects from that standpoint as well. So I think there is a lot of upside. I love the ideas, the water catchment, environmental, all the different pieces that can be done. We do need a courtyard. We have to do this. And where I have a little bit of a harder time, and I would almost need Councilwoman Ruddick to re-weigh in on this, but is the purchase thing makes, we have to do that. The upgrade or the $1 million to work on the facility quickly, that I am not 100% sure on, and actually prefer to get your opinion on that again, so I understand it from your perspective, because that one is harder for me to swallow right now, given the situation. But I mean, I could be persuaded to understand why that's so necessary as well. And I don't know how to balance that one out particularly well. So I'm just kind of looking for your feedback on that.
So if we have a favorable interest rate from the iBank, not just because they offer usually favorable interest rates anyway, but I'm guessing that they're in the process of developing some even more favorable packages, that you would want the interest rate to cover both. It might be favorable time to actually do acquisition and some construction, right? Rather than funding the acquisition and then later and interest rates are higher and you're trying to construct and blah, blah, blah. So I think you have to look at the cost of money now versus the cost of money later, as well as, what favorable programs are available now that might go away after the emergency is over. So, we don't have to do anything extravagant. We probably have to make it safe and we have to make it healthy. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, the luxury version. And then again, we can look at ways maybe to lease some use of the land or the space that we build to recoup some of those costs. So I think, I would reach out to, Virginia or other people with minds attuned to high finance and perhaps help us come up with a plan. But I'm guessing that any government funder is going to want to see a package.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunately my perspective as well. It's just, yeah, and it's hard because I'm running into this all the time now, where everybody wants, money spent on different things, and I agree with everything everybody says, and at some point we got to be like, hey, like community garden, this, that, all this different stuff. Like, how do we continue to move forward when we don't have the revenues coming in? But unfortunately, I agree with you. So I don't know what else to say besides that right now. It's getting these situations are getting tougher and tougher. But I'm in. I'm in. What do we need to do to anything? I guess this is more just advisory at this point, just discussionary. And Bob, you might be muted still. I think.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I think we have our direction on this item to keep moving on this item. I think we're clear.
Okay. And then so before we anything, I'm sorry, Councilwoman Ruddock, anything else on this topic before I move onward?
No, I think we need to get back to considering, the staff recommendations, whether we just want to continue those recommendations and bring them to the council. We do have closed session and open session this coming Tuesday, as well as the meeting on the 5th, which will be the really big meeting. So I'll leave it up to staff for a little guidance there.
Yeah, and just so you know, from my perspective, and it'd be good to get staff guidance as well. But I would want to, like, I need to see. I need to talk about the prioritization of the slides from the CIP before I can feel comfortable, like, I guess, making a recommendation of my own before moving forward. I just saw those two slides for the first time. I believe you did as well. And we talked about prioritizing them in front of council, which I think is brilliant. And I would love to do that, but I can't make a recommendation until I have a sense of how that lays out.
Let me just remind us too that Roy Salumi actually had a couple of questions that I don't think have been answered. And one of those was about, is that current list of capital project prioritized? So maybe staff could respond to Roy Salumi's questions.
Okay.
Sure, I'll start and then I'll turn it over to John. So the list that was before you today, they may have been a part of a prioritization process that John went through. I'll let him speak to that. But once we made it was kind of like, are they in or are they out? Once that list got to this list that composed the 1.8 million, at that point we didn't prioritize them anymore. But he has another list, to Roy's question, where he did go through and prioritize project. I think they had 5 criteria, and they used the criteria and established points and then ranked all the projects. So John, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure, and you might just want to bounce to the next slide there. And I know the answer is we're not going to go through this right now and deal with that. We'll be prepared to do this. But just to be clear for everybody watching, for the council members there and the mayor, we have been spending a great deal of time looking at the future and looking at where we think that fiscal year 1920 can take us. And this is just what we basically worked our way through, which were 4 criteria. Obviously, if you just look at the top line, public safety, grant funding, potential cost savings, project is underway, number of people affected or benefited from it. And then ultimately required by law was also a factor in consideration with that. But we basically scored those 4, and we can bring those forward, and you can kind of go through that process. Remember too, back to our original conversation, is that we will try to break these out more from the perspective of what also we're recommending moving forward with that are not general funded projects. So this really gives us one perspective, which is that all of these projects somehow are going off the list and will never come back. But there are a number of good and necessary projects that are intended to continue through because they're grant funded, because they are funded by the sewer fund or gas tax, SB1, whatever that may be. So the capital program continues on. I will make one last statement, and I don't want to be offensive in any way, but these projects don't happen unless there are either contractors or human beings managing them, bidding them, designing them, and overseeing the construction of them. So there is a balancing act also here with regard to what we have to do to manage and maintain these. We can't just fund the projects themselves and think they're going to magically happen. They will not, because staff and the people have to be behind that, working on that. And I know you know that, but I just felt it necessary to put that out on the table and on the record. And I apologize if in any way it may have offended you in any way. It was not intended that way. Just as a statement.
No, I don't think it offends. I think the harder part I'm dealing with with the public eye is conversely to your point, is if we're not utilizing so many projects or doing so many, all those people that you're talking about that are overseeing and doing all the work, why why do we need all those people still to oversee and do all these projects if we are doing that many projects anymore? So that's the give and take of what you're just saying.
And I will just say this, we have been over the last several years using a lot of consultant and outside assistance to help us manage, operate, and do these projects and deal with it.
Yeah.
So that right now has all been on the table, is on the cutting room floor, as you might say, and we have basically been squeezing all of that and shutting that down. So that's also where at some point either the projects become the responsibility of staff, or they don't happen because we're going to significantly reduce our contractual obligations and services as well with this. So everything kind of goes into the heap to be considered.
No, all good.
Mayor Eisen, we do have one more public comment on 880 Stone Pine, if you want to accept that at this time.
I'm okay accepting that. Debbie, Ms. Reddick, are you okay with that? Yep. Let's do it.
Virginia, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one point, which is you should continue seeking funding from the private sector as well as the government sector based on the comments that you made in terms of falling behind in the queue, whether the government program may be changed or altered or delayed. So you should make sure you've got several irons in the fire. That's my comment. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Anything else on Ray Saloom's questions? No, I think we're good there. Anything else, Councilwoman Ruddick? Do we need, so I guess, do we need to discuss the recommendation in terms of how we want to move forward with it?
Yeah, why don't we move back to that slide? Could someone take us back to those 3 recommendations? So this is our recommendation, and I think the committee has a couple options here. You could vote and move these recommendations forward formally, or you could kind of just accept them as they are. And given some of your comments, Mayor, that you want to spend a little time going through some of the projects and details, I think that's appropriate. So they could still be brought to the full council, and it would just be acknowledged that the committee discussed them, saw them, but they weren't ready to take a vote on them yet.
I mean, I'm trying to do my best to build as much consensus amongst council as possible and get as much feedback, so we're not kind of like making decisions on our own. So I do feel like that's the best approach,
Sure.
Personally. But like I'm curious to hear Councilwoman Ruddick weigh in on this as well.
So I would feel comfortable accepting the recommendations and bringing them forward to the full council. I will say at this point, I think the recommendations as they stand are supportable by me. Now, some might differ on the projects that are in that 1.8 million list, and that can be a council discussion. But personally, I think that the approach that we're taking, phase 1 is the balance of the fiscal year, and phase 2 is developing a budget, which is underway right now. The development of the budget is underway. So the work is being done for next year too. I think it's a sound approach. You know, there's a great article in the New York Times today. I actually printed it out for myself. It's about the you know, all the jobless claims and the layoffs, and so people who are being laid off are having trouble accessing, you know, unemployment. They can't get they have problems getting their stimulus checks. There's a lot of pain and suffering out there. And I think we are going to be dealing with the labor issue because everything's going to be on the table, but I don't see the rush. I think if we buy ourselves a couple months time with the proposal from staff, you know, we're not adding to the general misery because those are taxpayer burdens too, right? Creation of homeless, creation of more unemployed. You're reducing the amount of money available for, you know, consumption because, as somebody already mentioned, people are first paying off their debts. They're not buying stuff. So the economy benefits by people having jobs and getting income. And if, you know, we can buy ourselves a little time for a couple of months, you know, we've signaled to staff that everything's on the table, you know, going forward because we have to balance our budgets. I think it's a good approach. It buys people a little time. It lets us attenuate the problems while we work on the budget for a really tough year ahead. So I support the approach, and I would accept the recommendations and bring them forward to the full council.
Yeah, I think I'm just not ready. Personally, I'm not ready to do that. And we can go back and forth. I disagree. I think that my whole thought was less painful cuts now to avoid drastic cuts later on. I think if we make immediate action, and I know we disagree on this, but I think immediate action is needed to prevent all the more long. Every week we wait is less cuts that we have to take in the future. Every week that we don't take any action to shore up our loss of revenue coming in is more action we have to take further on down the road. I want to lessen the amount of overall one-time cut that happens and do more little pieces now in order to lessen the overall impact once we have to, like, okay, we finally have all the information, here's what actually needs to happen. I think if I am wrong, which I would hope that I am, and the economy recovers so much more quickly that we can repair that debt, you know, it's easier to come from that side and now be like, oh, we actually have funds for all this stuff. Let's start to do it this way. I'm more and again, you know, I'm not a government background person, but I look for immediate action to be taken and start reducing the expenditures that the city has immediately in order to try to maximize our overall loss throughout time. So different perspectives, I get it. And I think it's great to, well, it would be great to bring this in front of council and have them give their perspective as well.
So what I'm saying that we should do is accept the recommendations to bring forward to the council for consideration. You know, let me just add though that the proposal from staff balances the budget. That's our legal obligation, and that's what we will do. We will do it this year, and we will do it next year. This proposal balances the budget without furloughs and layoffs at this time. Now, we're in the process of developing a budget for the coming year where everything's going to be on the table because of the size of our deficit. We are beginning that discussion next Tuesday evening. So I mentioned at our last council meeting that I'm against overreaction because we are not a business. Business can slash and burn and does, and it doesn't care about people. Our job is different. We're the public sector. We provide public services. We provide those services with people. You lay off people, you reduce services. So that is an important decision, and it has to be done well. So I'm in favor of the short-term approach that we have right now that's going to balance the budget, and we're going to face this big, tough discussion very quickly here on the next budget where everything's on the table. So the approach that staff has laid out, I believe, is sound, and I stand by that. But my direction now is that we accept the recommendations. It doesn't say we approve the recommendations. We're accepting them so that we can bring this discussion to the council.
Okay, what's the difference?
Accepting versus approving.
Yeah, I guess, or I mean, just so I understand, because I don't want to put something in front of council saying like, here is our recommendation as well. And for council to be like, well, we actually have a lot, we'd like to discuss this further, before, I guess, I don't want to put words in other people's mouths per se. I want them to freely be able to discuss and make their own changes. So just
that's why we're accepting rather than approving.
Okay, good.
We're not adopting, we're not approving, we're accepting them and we're passing them along.
Okay, I can live with that.
Does that work?
It does. It does. And then, because I mean, I don't even, there's changes I would like to even make on these recommendations myself. And so I guess that'll be open for discussion when we discuss Tuesday night, regardless. And that's okay at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to make it clear though, when we say, bring me more options, bring me more options, there aren't a lot of options. Now, there might be refinements in terms of, well, this set of capital projects instead of that set of capital projects. But the options consist of labor, capital, a mix of the two. And the rest is refinements. There's not this whole entire universe of options. So I think we need to get over that idea that there's a range of 10, 12, 13 options.
I hear you. It's just weird to have not the labor option in front of us and to only have one way of going. And we don't even know how much, certain things would take, what percentage of essential employees, what, how we make that work. There's a lot of breaking down of other options that are just not presented in front of us. And I find that unsettling personally. But I do realize that there are only really two options to go, but we should have the numbers for both.
And that's why we're having the meeting next Tuesday.
Yep, which is good.
So, Mr. Mayor, if I may, a little agenda management. At this point, we're about to put the agenda and packet out for the Tuesday meeting. It has to go out tomorrow. So we do have a day here. The way the meeting is set up right now, council did ask to have a workshop. Well, let me just, right now we're set up as from 5 to 6 is closed session to have a discussion about labor negotiations. 6 to 7 is a workshop, and that workshop is a separate agenda from your normal agenda. And it was a general discussion about the response to COVID and so forth. There's no staff report for that item, but that's from 6 to 7. That was the workshop that was requested. The regular meeting, we have a few other items that are non-related to COVID. And then we also had on business an update from staff on the response to COVID, including in there would be our response to the financial situation that we're in. I think from what I'm hearing, I guess I want to throw this out. We could have this same presentation be an item for the full council at next Tuesday's meeting. That wasn't where we were heading, but given the comments that I just heard, I'm guessing that might be the desire to have a separate item, financial, just like the item you had, almost identical, with the same PowerPoint, and we would make that an item for next Tuesday. So I just wanted to check to see if that's something you wanted to do, or if I just kind of make minimal comments under my normal update, and then wait for May 5th. We can go either way. And then, as also was mentioned, at your discretion, if we are feeling like we need an extra meeting after next Tuesday, of course, the council always has the discretion to schedule a special meeting, between April 21st and May 5th as well.
So sorry. So can you, I kind of lost you for a second there with, are you saying that we have an agendized topic on the budget for this upcoming meeting, and whether or not to put what on that?
I apologize. In simple terms,
me.
I apologize. In simple terms, we were not planning an in-depth budget discussion for Tuesday. It was just going to be a very summarily a summary update as part of my COVID update, part of Matthew's COVID update. But we could add it and have it be a clear financial discussion, and use this exact same PowerPoint for the full council, if you'd like us to do that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So the staff report, just so since we're running out of time, we don't usually put the PowerPoints up. We put staff reports up, and then we make PowerPoint presentations. Since this PowerPoint has now been aired, I would say that pretty much will become the staff report. We'll put a very short one-page cover on it that just says the Finance Committee reviewed all this, and we're now going to make a similar presentation to the full council, and we'll attach the PowerPoint that you just saw verbatim, and then we'll have that'll probably be an hour item with the full council.
Very, very good. And I mean,
yes, okay. I will get with Jessica very quickly. She's probably texting me already, but we'll add this as a business item then, so we don't lose any time, and then we'll still have May 5th ahead of us for future budget planning.
Yeah, and then I mean, I don't know if you guys have, and I'm not suggesting you do, but like if there's any ability to include like the extra column, let's just say, or like what is being kept, those types of things that we discussed today. If we can't do it now, let's do that because I realize you probably have a billion things, and I know you have to get it out to us so we can go through it beforehand, and all that stuff, and the prioritization of the projects and the project kept and all that stuff. But we can do that in the future. I have no idea what that
we can add those. I know the two columns you're talking about, so we can add that. We can't. Yeah, we don't have time to do much more than that. But that one slide where we listed all the projects, you wanted to see the context of how much was being retained from some of those. So we can add that column.
I think Councilwoman Ruddick has a few things. Yeah.
I definitely want included that capital project prioritization that was put up that John supplied.
We'll add that as well.
Why they talked about selected certain project. I think that was very useful.
Great.
And I just want to say before we close that I appreciate everything staff is doing. I appreciate everything the mayor is doing. I'm glad the public is engaged on the issue. This is a very extraordinary time, as you know. This isn't your, run-of-the-mill recession. It's uncharted territory, and everybody is doing, the best they can. And I would just say that I think it's really important for us to be kind and to speak as civilly as we can. I mean, I'm not saying don't bring up issues, don't have hard discussions, don't get passionate about things, but ultimately we have to be kind, take the personal out of it, and just remember that, we don't need extra tension in our lives. These decisions are hard enough without, Sturm und Drang, all around it. So volume that we speak with each other, the words that we use, let's just try to be cognizant that that we can make things go more smoothly, and we should, and we must.
No, agreed. We should all be doing our part. Hopefully you felt that way about this meeting. I felt like everybody did a great job on that. So I appreciate everybody's time. I do realize that tempers can get flared. Lots of topics. People are losing. And we're talking about money, jobs, projects people want done, all the various things. It is rough. It's really rough. And the amount of public input I get every day coming my way as mayor right now is also very hard to deal with. So there's a lot to take on right now. I don't disagree with you. And I hope we can all continue to be as kind and helpful towards one another as possible. I'm all in. Anything else we need to do, or anybody want to say anything before we move on to public comment at this point? I think we're good on these topics. Okay. Onward to public comment. Do we have any public comment for the end of the meeting?
Not so far. So I would just
wait a minute.
Clarify to the attendees that this public forum section is for any comments related to the purview of this subcommittee for items that were not listed on the agenda. So if anyone does have any comments of that nature, please use the raise your hand feature. Okay, Virginia, go ahead.
Great meeting, very cordial. Appreciate everybody's inputs. I did forget one thing in terms of additional revenue sources. And that would be focusing on a lot of these unkept lots that are all around that we would get a lot more revenue if there were homes built on them. And further, they're just unkempt. I mean, there are some that I've seen since the period I've lived here where they haven't put a weed whacker to it, and they're a blight on the community. So again, I'd either fine these individuals or significantly raise property taxes on vacant lots so that they would have a greater incentive to turn them over to developers to develop housing. Thanks. Great meeting.
Thanks, Virginia. Matthew,
All right,
go ahead.
Oh, yep.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, thank you again. I concur. Great meeting with Virginia, or great meeting for everybody. Great cordial. I also feel like from a revenue generation perspective, that the 880 Stone Pine, I think two things come to mind: microgrids, right? Is there an opportunity for us to put a solar farm on that land and battery storage? Energy is money, right? Energy is a revenue source. So if we can generate our own energy, why not? I think it'll tick multiple boxes from, the power outages that we have, revenue, sustainability, all these types of things. And I also think water is also a revenue source, right? Is an opportunity for us to think about rainwater catchment and how we use. Right now, we're using drinking water to flush all of our toilets across the city, right? Is there an opportunity for us to use rainwater here in a way that's perhaps more sustainable? What are our, so I would just say in these times, I think it's perhaps great for us to think a little creatively about how we generate revenue. But I concur with, I've been involved in some planning and staffing issues with the city. I love our city staff and the team that you've built there, Bob. Fantastic. I've had great experience with them, and I couldn't be happier to be in this community with the leadership the city council showing and your staff, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to point out to Matthew's point that there are wells on that property. I think there's 4 wells, or at least 4 water connections. So there is water there.
let's sell it. Or let's use it, let's use it to augment our city water usage. Thank you.
Okay.
We have one more.
Keep
Mayor,
it going.
sorry.
That's fine. Yep.
Paulette, go ahead.
There we go. Okay, I've unmuted. Okay, so again, I agree with everyone. It's a very important meeting. I'm glad that you're having this meeting. It's a very, I can't say fully productive meeting from my standpoint, from my viewpoint, but certainly productive. Because honestly, I'm not sure why we are not looking initially at what are our essential services? What's our essential staff? And what's our essential services and and then we look into essential programs. But to first start out with where we were when I first got to Half Moon Bay 10 years ago, which is we were at bare bones. Now, there were things not being done that were important to be done in that bare bones situation. So I don't think we can compare exactly to then in terms of coming up with what was that budget that we were running on at that time when our finances were in a bad way. Because there were certainly infrastructure and maintenance things that I believe must be done that weren't being done at that time. So, but I still feel like we're not starting from the basis of essential staff and essential services, and then prioritizing our essential programs that we feel would be, that we feel would absolutely be have such a negative impact if we didn't go forward with it. So, we're looking at cost cutting as opposed to like, okay, we're in a really bad way. Let's get down to the essence, gets into our essentials, and then build on that to see what else we can afford. So I just feel it's a little bit ass backwards kind of thing. And, I would really like to see that because I would like to know what can this city run on in terms of money? What money do we absolutely have to have? And then build from there. So again, thanks for the work everyone's put in, but I still would like to see, frankly, more in order for the city council to make truly informed decisions going forward at this critical time to know how to deal with this unprecedented situation. Thank you.
That's it for public forum, Mayor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I just want to really thank staff for taking the time to prepare for this meeting. As Councilwoman Ruddick said, I mean, whew, it's a lot we're dealing with right now, and it is none of it is easy. And it's hard. So lots of work being put into this presentation to prepare. Thank you. I want to thank Councilwoman Ruddick. Thank you so much for expressing all your different points, having your leadership and past experience with the council and the city and government as a whole is such a tremendous asset to us right now, especially as we navigate our way through these completely uncharted waters. So thank you so much for everything that you're bringing to the table as well. We just value your contribution so heavily. So thank you. And that's it. We can adjourn. And thank you all for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.